Welcome, everybody, to Millennia and Microcosm Week 54. Over a year we've spent going through the first four chapters of this book, and we are still just past the halfway mark on chapter 4. And there's so many fabulous chapters to come. But it makes sense because chapter 4 is a chewy one. It's the equivalent of, like, I don't know, 8 chapters. And we could certainly take our time digging through it. But I think now we're starting to pick up speed because the ideas are building on each other. So this is section E of chapter 4. We've done A, B, C, and D so far, and they all build on each other. Section E, daimon and eudaimonia, is exploring the concepts of human character, human fate, what happens to us in our lives, how our character and our fate are related to each other. That the Greeks had this concept of free will and determinism that's more sophisticated than the modern one, that it is both deterministic and you have free will at the same time, but in very specific ways, according to the relationships between the self and the character and so forth. We've been exploring some of this. We're working our way through his text. I think last week where were we? We wrapped up paragraph 4 last week, and I threw the sentence in the chat there. We are fated to collaborate in that conspiracy, which is our fate. The typical Kenneth Smith chewy statement. Oh, we haven't even got to the next paragraph, and Phil wants to say something. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I want to rethink about that last statement and what's implied by the previous thing that led to the last statement. But I'll first start out by saying, because I've been thinking about this in a funny way, I'll start out by saying that I didn't do it, but once my friend went to a restaurant and he got a fortune cookie that said, disregard all previous fortune cookies. I think that's a dialectic at the optimum at work. And so my thought is, it actually came from a combination of attending a thing on Heisenberg's, theory about, I guess, the what is the quantum theory, and also I attended something about Schilling, which is interesting, and of course Fichte, and I came to this thought that's interesting. And it actually, in some ways, related to divided line in mathematics. And actually relates, so many things come in handy to Heidegger's thing about the Greek temple. As I mentioned, Heidegger thought that was the height of Greek art because it was a place where the gods or God met human society, human beings. And there was you could either see it as a champagne social or a negotiation place. And my thought is that the question about mathematics is like, which side of the divided line is it in? And I profess it's really on this side, and some people think it's really at least in a transitional place to the other side. So then I thought about the forms. In some way, the divided line is about the finite confronting the infinite. And my thought is that one way to think about it is that the infinite is governed by some structure, some rules, and we don't understand those rules, and that we are trying to cross the divided line to get those rules. But the alternative to that is the interesting one. The infinite, by virtue of being infinite, is governed by no rules. It's totally, absolutely free. And so therefore, in a sense, the question about quantum theory is it the principle of indeterminacy or the principle of uncertainty? Uncertainty would suggest that we are somehow in error, and there is some structure that we don't understand that's deeper than us. And we have to find out that structure because we are incomplete The other way around is that indeterminacy is no. On the other side of the vital line, it's totally differentiated. Everything is different from everything else. And it behaved. The best we could come up with is probabilities, because we can't not see what it is. And the alternative view is that, in some sense, inside the temple, where we have this negotiation, is that we are talking to God, who's absolutely, totally free. And the forms are part of imagination. And we are begging God in our exchange, we need to have order in this side in order to constrain ourselves from being edging toward being absolutely free, because we can't handle that kind of freedom.
Right.
Okay. And so as a result is that we are constraining ourselves, because each one of us is so different. If we let ourselves be totally loose and be absolutely free, we cannot have order. Like you gods could handle that kind of non-order because you are infinite, right? And so therefore, in a funny way, is that, and it really relates to Kant in the sense that we are human beings that necessarily require the categorical imperative to structure our understanding. It is our understanding that needs structure because we can't handle total non-structure.
Right.
Okay. We seek that. So that's a kind of a different way of looking at it, a kind of a something that arises out of our mind in terms of, in a funny way, negation, because we confronted infinity and we can't handle infinity. We just cannot. And we are telling God, you are infinite being. You could be anything you want to be. We can't. And the best we could do is come together as a society and judge and help each other as a group. That relates to the last sentence. We are fated to collaborate in this conspiracy, which is our fate, because we are imperfect. And so the best we could do is create this sort of semi-categorical judgment with ourselves and say, no, it's not that, it's not this. And, and God, please don't throw down the infinite to us. Because we can't handle the infinite.
That's right.
We can't handle the truth.
That's right.
Okay. So that's interesting. It's almost the opposite. And we come up with mathematics in order to create the structure of understanding that we could at least come to maybe understand for our own good, to control the infinity that we can't handle. So
right.
I'm just proposing, this is what I mean, like, disregard all previous fortune cookies if you can handle it. Right? If you can, go ahead and look at those fortune cookies, because you need the structure,
Yes.
Like Wednesday, you will run into a friend that you've never seen before. Oh,
right.
Because otherwise you don't know what's what. So that's kind of interesting, the relationship between the one and the many. That's a very different way of looking at it. And if you look at it that way, in a sense, you are actually begging the question, it's because we actually can't handle the truth.
Right.
Right. That we need a limited truth in order to operate as a human being.
Right.
That's my thought about this, because that's a very powerful sentence. And that's my thought, with the help of Heisenberg and Niels Bohr, with the help of Fichte, with the help of Schilling, in that funny relationship. And of course, Hegel is, I think, on the other side, but nonetheless, it's an interesting look. All right, that's all I want to say. But I thought it was important to make that connection before we jump into the next paragraph.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Phil. On that note, let's do Lisa and then Sharon. Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, Phil, I love Phil's word, voice, and mind. Let me tell you, I comment about it all the time. Limited, we can't handle the truth as a group of people, but doesn't collaboration and identifying the purpose bring you closer to the truth? And the collaboration creates many views, which brings us closer to the truth. And the boundaries that are created by the purpose where we're driving to is the collaboration gives you an unlimited feeling, but once we bring the purpose in, it limits things. And then you work within that purpose or those boundaries. And that creates the civility around a group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And then the bonding is created because we all are driving toward the same purpose.
Right. Right.
Okay.
This goes right to the heart of the Greek concept of chaos versus cosmos, which, you know, from I mentioned this last week, from the old fighting units of the ancient Hellenic peoples when they invaded from the north and from the east and came down into the peninsula. The reason they were able to dominate the people who were there was because of their fighting prowess. The reason they were able to fight off other people who tried to invade was because of their fighting prowess. So, you know, there's a reason why Ares is one of the important deities among the Olympians. They saw themselves as a warrior people who was creating a zone within which you could have peace and doing it through military means. But core to their concept of the military was not just the individual wins, but this idea you're talking about aligning their purposes with each other. That if until you align with each other, you have a chaos in which each of you is proceeding at the cost of the other, so that everybody's slipping back while they try to move forward. That this is the condition of chaos they were concerned about. And when you read the cosmogonies, like Hesiod's theogony, he'll talk about how there was a stage before people could exist when the universe had too much chaos for us. We're finite mortal things. We need a certain amount of order, or else we can't survive at all. We can't even exist, let alone get ourselves pointed in the same direction. And that part of the glory, they thought, of the Olympian pantheon was that they weren't just representing all the raw infinite powers of the universe like the Titans before them, but that they were representing a new order, the Olympian order, in which persuasion rather than violence would rule the people. Persuasion could be used so that people could find their way into a cosmos together and become an orderly group, become an organism that could rule itself, rather than just have all their energies dissipated fighting amongst each other.
Rule themselves and grow.
And grow, yeah.
Toward a common purpose, which
Exactly.
then creates bonds with each other. Instead of war bonds, you have similarities, and we're not dividing each other because we all have a one purpose. But I don't know.
Yeah, shared mythos and principles and values. This is why section E, daimon and eudaimonia, is heavily about Heraclitus. Kenneth Smith's drawing off of Heraclitus, and one of Heraclitus's famous quotes on this particular topic is that a people must fight for its laws as fiercely as it would fight for the city walls if it were being invaded. And by laws, the nomos, he's talking about the cosmos that you create together. You got to fight for the ability to work effectively together. It's worth sacrificing and struggling to figure out how can we collaborate as a living, growing organism, rather than fall apart into squabbling individuals. And so there, Heraclitus, without ever using the words from chaos or cosmos, he's echoing the concern. You can find it once you're aware of how much the Greeks were worried about civil war and falling apart into chaos. You start to notice there almost isn't any great Greek writer who doesn't come back to this theme over and over and over. It was the preoccupation of the Greeks to try not to fall apart again into chaos. Thus the irony of the Peloponnesian War and the wars that followed. Sharon and then Donald. Go ahead, Sharon.
So I have a very, very different interpretation of those sentences, and I would like to express it. And to do that, I want to go back about 3 sentences where it says the Greek concept of a daimon argues that, ironically, human beings in every case are complicitous with their own seductive and subliminal inner fate. Fate is not coercion. It is instead self-oppression, self-blindness, self-deception. We are fated to collaborate in that conspiracy, which is our fate. And I don't see that as a societal issue. I see that as an individual human issue, because I think that free will and fate are not separate. And our experience of free will in the past becomes our fate in the future. And so I wonder if you could comment on that, because I see this as all individual, not as society, not as a society. And the collaboration is how you collaborate with your past and future acts.
Yes. Thank you, Sharon. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, this concept of daimons drawing off of this one particular fragment of Heraclitus, ethos anthropoi daimon, which ethos referring to your character, anthropoi referring to man in the non-gendered sense, and daimon. Well, this is what this whole section is about: is what do they mean by daimon? And so, this has been variously translated either as character, as fate is the simple version, and the more complex version is when we start saying that a human being's character rules over them as effectively as a god rules over its domain, right? So Ares, the god of war, Poseidon, the god of the ocean, and my personal daimon rules over me through my character. The character is the domain of this divinity. As a divinity, its power over my character is infinite, and I'm finite. So I have to mediate. This relationship is a complicated one in which I can't just tell it what I want it to do. If anybody's going to be dictating, it's going to be dictating to me. But in fact, it doesn't even do that. It just works my character, and then suddenly I want things or don't want things, and notice things and don't notice things, and never figure out how I'm being ridden. So you're right that the first and most important level of this fragment is directed at the individual, and
Yes.
And this is what Kenneth is drawing off of in these sentences leading up to the end of that paragraph. He's talking about the problem for a human being. What is the relationship to fate? And in this, I've referenced before this way in which moderns always read the myth of the genie and the lamp from the Arabian Nights. We always read it as though the genie wants to cheat you, and he's just going to take the literal interpretation of what you say and cheat you out of what you want. But even though he's not talking about genies and lamps, we are talking about a daimon, which is a kind of divinity. So there is an analogy to be drawn here, which is Heraclitus is saying the daimon is not. The daimon's not trying to cheat you. The genie's not trying to cheat you. It's that they're infinite and you're finite, and you don't understand the consequences of your actions, right? If you ask for something to happen, if you try to make something happen, a whole train of consequences are going to follow that are obvious to a genie or a daimon, but are invisible to us. And so largely, you're right. I mean, the initial thrust of this fragment and these sentences is to try to get people to wake up and stop blaming fate or the gods or anything but themselves for the way things come out. We aren't gods. We aren't creators of our own life and our own fate in an absolute sense, but we're not helpless victims either. We're co-conspirators. We're collaborators in creating our life, and that in everything that happens, including the things we don't want to happen, even though there are other forces at work, there's also our own fingerprints.
Yes.
We're playing a role not only in the good things that happened that we wanted, but in the bad things that happened that we didn't want, but that we still set in motion through the things that we were doing.
So is this is individual, but it could be interpreted as societal. Is that what you're saying?
That's where it gets interesting, right? It gets interesting. It gets interesting here because anthropoi is an ambiguous term in the Greek. Right, we're talking about it's like the capital M man, in formal English. It's like, well, we could be talking about an individual, and that's the most immediate and important interpretation. But we could also be talking about Homo sapiens, And we could be talking about a culture or a civilization or a polis or a family or a neighborhood. Man at every possible level of organization is yet another organism, just like the individual is, who discovers, remember the Greeks are interpreting everything as an organism. So you discover that just like your fate is partly written by your own character, even if you don't know your own character and you don't know what it's writing, the same is true of a family. The family has a character, and the family has a fate that's being partly written by the family's character, and the same for Homo sapiens as a whole or anything in between. So those are sort of after one kind of grasps the individual level, which is the most important to immediately confront. After that, you sort of want to come back to this fragment and start to see how there is this dialectical relationship where it keeps applying at greater levels of organization. So yeah, it applies to a culture as well. It applies to an epoch of history. What is the spirit of an age? What are people in general organizing themselves around, in the ancient world? That's an example of anthropoi as well, just like Sharon as an individual is an example of anthropoi. So, and of course, this kind of level of packing, this isn't cheating. We're not shoving this interpretation into Heraclitus. He worked hard to write this way. He did it on purpose. He was from that generation before Socrates that was trying to make these dense nuggets of wisdom that you could come back to over and over and over and find more in them. And, the more Heraclitus you study, the more you can see where he will use very odd phrasings to turn away from an easy but finite statement into a more difficult and paradoxical statement that has deeper profundity. This is like his whole thing as a writer, is to write something that must be understood at multiple levels at the same time. It's his pride and joy. Nietzsche would write about this later and say, oh my God, how he wished he could do that, right? Nietzsche's famous quote is, I want to say in 10 sentences what other people say in a book. And then he says, what other people don't say in a book. He wants to get more than a book's worth into 10 sentences. And Kenneth Smith loves aphorisms. He loves these dense nuggets. When he writes a sentence like, we are fated to collaborate in that conspiracy, which is our fate, you just know he spent some time, stroking his beard and staring at the keyboard and going, not like this, not like this. And when he finally found the wording, he's like, oh yeah, there we go. Now I'm starting, now I'm chugging with Nietzsche and Heraclitus. This is my goal. I want to say these dense things you have to come back to over and over and find more and more in them. So thanks for bringing that up, Sharon. You're right. We started out this conversation focusing on the larger scale and the community. And in doing so, we were only getting a fragment of this fragment. The individual is right there at the center of it. You're right. Donald, and then Stephen, and then Phil. Go ahead, Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, when you talk about chaos versus cosmos, to try and make it somewhat concrete, just think of war as described in the Iliad by Homer. And it's the individual warriors and heroes battling it out on the battlefield. And then skip forward 700 years to the Peloponnesian War and the orderly phalanxes, the intense cooperation. Or think about how the Romans or Caesar, with a handful of legions, rips through hundreds of thousands of Gauls, because they so it was individual, and for him it was a cosmos. It was an orderly, almost machine that fought. I find that that the waging of war in Greek history really shows the difference between chaos and cosmos. And on this other thing, when I was quite, 50 years ago, Kenneth was recommending a book at the time. It was quite interesting. It was by Stanislaw Lem, the Polish cyberneticist, called the Siberiad, which has these two kind of, they're called constructors. They make things, they'll do things, and you can ask them to do things. Only things go wrong, not in this infinite versus finite stuff, but the constructors are strictly bound by sort of modern language, or not modern, modern logic, set theory, symbolic language, you know, and you get, as with the infinite and the finite, only it's like they're even more finite. We're the ones that are infinite. Completely unexpected results. I remember one of the stories was, you know, somebody says, I want everything that begins with the letter N to be eliminated. And they set about doing this request quite logically. In some language, the word for everything begins with N. There is a language in which every item that exists begins with the letter N. And therefore, you must have really wanted them to destroy the complete universe in its entirety. And they set about doing it. You know, this continual mismatch, this inability to bridge that. I think that's enough. But
I'm glad you pointed us to that, because he hadn't mentioned the Siberia to me yet, so now I've got another book to follow up on from Kenneth, and I put a link to it there for those who haven't heard of it.
You know, when I was 22, he thought it was a really good book, and I own about 3 copies of it. but it is about this mismatch between real language, formal language, sort of fuzzy logic, and modern logic, symbolic logic, and it's just shows that. But yeah, I had not thought of it until you talked about this mismatch, like with the genie and the rubber of the lamp.
Yes,
you know, that how this goes wrong, and I think this is an example of it goes wrong the other way. You know,
right. This is a counterexample. Thanks, Donald. Stephen, and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, what I'm finding, I've been, you know, hanging around with philosophy groups.
Oop, you froze up there, Stephen. Ruh-roh. Might be a bad connection on Stephen's end. We'll have to wait till he returns. I guess we'll switch on to Phil, and we'll come back to Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
There.
Oh, wait, there he is.
Yeah.
Are you there, Stephen? You're breaking up a bunch.
He's teasing us.
He is. He's dangling a little nugget of wisdom and then pulling it back. Sorry, did you want this? Oh, nope. Connection problems. All right, we'll try again later. Let's go on to Phil, and we'll come back to Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I sort of want to address what Sharon brought up, and I want to bring it into language as well. That's what you brought up in the answer to it. I think the individual in relationship to the group. Okay. You know, I think the diamond is not a one-dimensional thing. It's it's like a diamond. It's refractive, okay, in some sense. And I think the secret with that refraction is that within the diamond, there's already the potentiality for understanding otherness. Without that, then it becomes a separation. There's me, and there's those guys over there. There's everybody over there, and I'm different. I am unique. I'm totally different. But I think in the human being, I think because of this understanding of otherness, or at least a potential for understanding otherness, is why we form into groups, right? In some sense, we crave otherness. And that's kind of reflected in Greek tragedies. You know, remember I mentioned the difference between, let's say, Shakespeare, Hamlet is talking to himself. I presume that his otherness is himself. With the Greeks, the otherness is sort of dispersed, you know? So when Oedipus does his thing, the otherness is like, oh, no, don't do that, right? And so he's not hearing it well, but nonetheless, they're there, right? And I think that connection within oneself to what is outside oneself, the otherness, creates the potential for a unity of its own. Whereas that without it, then it becomes the hard law, which means the prison bars will create maybe some sense of otherness, like in some sense. So I think that's important. And that relates to language in a funny way. You know, we are moving more and more in a direction of symbolic logic and a mechanical logic, which is really the relationship between identity and difference. And when you purify the language and you throw out all the difference, then you're left with the pure identity of something. And I think what that does in some sense is the logic itself, the language itself excludes otherness more and more till you get to the pure, it's either this or it's not that, right? And I think to bring back the otherness, and Hegel actually does that because he doesn't eliminate, he just simply supplement, the otherness, but it's around, which is always true, like it's not that, you go out and you say, well, I'm so with the others, I've completely forgotten myself. Well, I guess once in a while you could, but most of the time, yeah, there's me and there's these others, they count, they're there, but I'm also there. So there's an equivocal relationship between, like, on the one hand, me and others. That's why I guess I'm attracted to equivocation, because you have to make that relationship, because the otherness is within you. So you got to go across the border, right? Yeah. But on the other hand, you also can't just sort of stay on the other side,
right,
and not return to the self.
Yeah.
So that equivocation is necessary in actually mythic language or poetic language, because it doesn't exclude the others.
Right.
You could turn the focus more to the other or less to the other, more to yourself, but it's always there, floating in the background, because it's always related to a whole. So I think that doesn't. I think when you go to, like I said, the temple, you bring all that multidimensionality there in relationship, to, I guess in some ways God is totally other. Maybe not the Greek gods, the ancient gods, because they're fragmented as well. So I'll just leave it there. So
thank you, Phil.
Let's hope.
Yeah, that's right. We got this equivocation between the self and the other, the individual and the group, and that equivocation is necessary if we're going to deal well with both parts of that, because our nature is, as Heraclitus keeps telling us over and over, it's paradoxical. Everywhere we look, we think we're walking on solid ground, but instead we're walking on paradoxes, and our feet are paradoxes. Our mind is a paradox. It's and not in the logical, a paradox is a contradiction sense, but in the sense of it's a dynamic system in which there is tension and dynamic power in the relationship between the two. And all of that is always present whenever we're dealing with Heraclitus. He foregrounds this thing that most of us spend most of our lives trying not to think about, including most philosophers spend most of their time trying not to look squarely at the fabric of paradoxes that makes up human existence. So, but yeah, the individual and the group. Thank you. Stephen, you're back. Go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
What I was going to say is this, that all these philosophy groups I go to, they're not actually discussing philosophy in a lot of places. Here you are a bit, which is interesting, but they're endlessly talking about what they want, how they want things to turn out. And yeah, this is mixed up with some dangers. I have a sort of a difference of opinion about what the Greeks were worried about. And you say they're worried about civil war. I question that, because every state had a small army of citizens. They must have been practicing a few fights before the classical age. So war between the states, in this case, Greece, was already there. I always get the feeling that it was actually the imposition of the Persian Empire that was creating the great sense of pessimism.
Yeah.
But this is my huge problem. If you're in these groups and you start directing people back to philosophy, and you say, what are you talking about?
Right.
You keep on saying that enough, they'll get angry. They're always talking about what they want, and they never ask the question, why do I want that?
Right.
Who am I?
Right.
And yeah, they expect, if I want the perfect world where I get everything I want, it's going to be fantastic, no problem. If I'm a 17-year-old boy and I have a choice between a classic library with all the classic volumes in it and peace and quiet, and I've given the other option, and I can walk through another door and become an Ottoman prince with a large harem, as a 17-year-old boy, I'm going to, take the Ottoman option. But will that really be a great idea in the long run? And this is it. Everywhere people are talking about their choices and what they want, but nowhere in the news do you see questions really being asked about who we are, what we want, and what is really appropriate to us. That was even in the Christian religion.
Right.
Even your priests and your biblical people were warning people, beware, there's things appropriate to a human being. There's a condition of living which is appropriate to a human being. And you start going beyond that, you're heading into a world of danger. Well, they have the legend of Atlantis. The Atlanteans, as smart as they were, get too much power and too much force and end up destroying themselves. Now, I've been listening to Kenneth's work here, and I realise that my understanding is limited, but he spends a lot of time talking about nature.
Right.
And how the Greeks felt that nature was a great power. The modern world thinks man is a great power.
Mm-hmm.
And to an extent, man is a power. But they think nature is completely at our command. You sort of think of the thing that, well, when you get the experience of nature, you're sort of like that young boy who walks too far in the forest and suddenly finds it's not that easy. Once you're taken away from all the advantages of a human civilization, it's not that easy. And this is a warning. This is something that modern man has so much power at their command and so much economy, whereas the ancients didn't have the disadvantage of those distractions. They were still closer to nature. They still understood the threat. They still understood that they were dependent intimately on nature. And this has been forgotten. I'm living in a world of smarty pants people who think that because they hold a mobile phone, they're a god. And this is a worry. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, a couple of things. Yeah, when I talk about civil war with the Greeks, you're right. I'm not explaining the context that I mean. You know, they all kept standing armies. They were all prepared to fight the other polises. But what they didn't want was for the polis to fight itself. That's what they were terrified of. Because if the polis fights itself, then your fighting unit falls apart into chaos. Now, the Athenians, under the pressure of the Persian War, they saw this as an opportunity to try to wield all the polises into one great Greek people. They, you know, a number of writers have talked about the way that the Greeks sort of discovered the idea of being Greek by being attacked by Persians who saw them as a whole that they didn't see themselves as, right? The Greeks saw themselves as separate tribes, separate polises, and so forth. And that it was under this pressure of the Persian invasion that they sort of discover, oh, are we a people? should we be thinking larger than the city-state as an organizational unit? And Athens tries to, you know, flush with the wealth from the Delian League and everybody pouring the money in to fund the military expedition against the Persians. Afterwards, the Athenians are like, can't we just keep things this way? Because wow, it's really cool to have all this money. And we'll just build all these beautiful temples and things. Isn't this great, everybody? And everybody else is like, I don't know, man. We seem to be paying all the money and you seem to be able to build all the temples. So I don't know if this is such a good thing. And, you know, this is where that question of, can the ancient Greek city-states see themselves as something larger than the city-state? Or are they going to just collapse back down to that smaller unit of organization? And I think what you're alluding to, Stephen, is right on the money, that they were terrified of civil war within the city-state, but they were ready at all times to fight each other, which meant that they were, you know, civil war as a whole, as a whole people was not concerning for them the way it should have been. And that's probably, if we look at the history of how it is that they managed to replicate in some ways the downfall of the Trojan War by turning on each other, this is probably the blind spot. This is probably the very pulse of the blind spot that enabled the tragedy. That they had the proper level of concern about civil war within a polis, but they didn't have the proper level of concern between polises, and that was where the fragments appear between the alliance.
Okay, I take your point there, that you're talking about the internal.
Yeah.
Line. So if we use the Trojan War as an example, it was the dissension. But yeah, there's a bit of a problem there because the Trojan War did literally involve a whole series of polises or kingdoms joining together to fight the Trojans. But so where was the tragedy, this internal tragedy in the story of the Trojan War?
But you see what happens on their returns, right? What happens to Agamemnon? What happens to Odysseus?
Okay, beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the tales of the returns, right? It's like they go home and their families aren't holding together. The city-states aren't. Everything has fallen apart, and they've lost their city-state level cosmos. They didn't just lose the fragmentation of the big alliance. In fact, the pressures of the big alliance tore apart the wholeness of the smaller units. There's all kinds of stuff in here that to an ancient Greek is just like, it's foregrounded. It's the major, it's what the story's about to them, but it's hard for a modern to see, you know, the terror of you go home and, you know, your spouse murders you. It's like, you thought that was the safe place, you know, and that from that foundation, you could go out and build something larger, but you were so busy building something larger, you forgot to pay attention to your foundations. It's like there's for them, Kenneth often says that the thing that's hardest for moderns to understand about the Iliad is that for the ancients, the three realms the home, the markets, and the polis were three separate realms. This is what Hannah Arendt writes about it in The Human Condition. And they had very clear ideas about what each one was for and how they build on each other. And that they saw confusion among the three realms as horrific. That was like, it was blasphemous. It was just disgusting. It's like walking in on your parents having sex in front of you. It's something that should never ever happen, right? It's hard to explain the level of fear and disgust they had around it. So, you know, the cleverness of Odysseus keeping the different leaders from fighting amongst each other by having them all swear the oath to defend the marriage between Helen and whoever wins her. So that instead of constantly trying to steal Helen away from each other, they'll all back each other up. That's a domestic arrangement. It's supposed to be private to the household. And Odysseus has used this trick to avoid fighting among the city-states by exposing the domestic level and using it to tie treaties together. To the Greeks, that was obscene. It was clever, but it was obscene. It was a violation of the realms. And that it could lead to the collapse of the entire Bronze Age Mediterranean civilization and cause a 700-year dark age. To the Greeks, this is not a surprise, because you're not supposed to cross those streams. And Odysseus's cleverness was he secures the momentary peace at the cost of 700 years of a dark age. You know, these are the sorts of things they're thinking about, and when we're trying to understand the difference between a modern perspective and an ancient perspective. So, anyway, Stasis, Civil War.
Oh, okay. So it was polis, market, the three realms. Polis,
yeah, the home,
market,
the
home,
oikos,
right.
the home.
Beautiful. Okay,
Yeah.
I can see a point there. If I was to think about the Vikings, a lot of these are ordinary farmers. The big king, the big chief says, we're going to attack someplace. And these guys aren't particularly interested. They might have been a little bit interested in the loot, but they've been taken away from their homes for a few months or a few weeks. And that means trouble is going to brew in a lot of cases. They're not going to have their hand there. And at the same time, they're fighting the other side, worrying if they're going to get killed. They're freaking out. What's going on at home? Has that been done? Has this been done? Is somebody trying to muscle in on what I've got? Okay, yeah, I can pick that up. Thank you.
My pleasure. Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
So may I go back to the text so I could try to understand where the discussion is heading, please? The next sentence that says, only from the whole shape of an individual's life can we ascertain whether the ultimate force architecting that life was for the best or for the worst. We discover only ex post facto whether a dysdynamic working an ill-tending destiny or a eudynamic working a well-tending destiny, which is some of the stuff you were just talking about. Principle made that life the organic whole it grew into. For humans to be subject to the fate is to be such a pawn, a single thread rammed into the place in the warp and wool of a design not visible to the mere materials. Yes. So if you can comment on that and kind of tie it together with the discussion that you're now having, non-philosopher like me would really understand it. Thanks.
My pleasure, Sharon. My pleasure. Thanks for drawing us back to the text. So yeah, you know, here he's drawing on this, you know, the critical thing is this idea that, you know, having up until this paragraph established this idea of the daimon and as ruling our character and therefore having our fingerprints in our own fate, he then draws us on to the next stage, which is saying our challenge is that, you know, as Stephen alluded to a few weeks ago, what if your daimon doesn't like you? You know, what if your daimon, you know, is or it might not even be personal from its perspective, even though it's personal from your perspective, since your character is getting in your way. But, you know, what if your daimon is not a healthy one? What if your character is not a healthy character? What if you're subject to what if you're born addicted to alcohol like I am? My wife can have a glass of wine and it's great, and I don't dare touch it because my character has predisposed me to have this tragic weakness just waiting for me to step into it. Now, if I know what my character is, I can work around that problem. But if I don't know what my character is, then my wife and I would go out for a normal event, but we would come home two different people. She would have had a pleasant night and, be having a pleasant experience, and I would be on a road to ruin and not even know it. There is this sense in which, our daimon predisposes us to good and or bad. And if we don't know what those things are, within us, then we're setting ourselves up for disaster. This is part of why whenever he's talking about character and fate and daimons, he comes back over and over to Oedipus Rex or Oedipus Tyrannus, right? The rise of a shepherd boy to become king seems like the greatest of victories, right up until you discover that everything has gone wrong to make that possible. And it's only at the height of his powers, when everybody admires him, that the truth begins to come out step by step about what a horror this is, that he murdered his own father and didn't know it, that he married his own mother and didn't know it, that the plague, the miasma, everything going wrong in Thebes is because of him, who is trying his best to be the best of all possible kings, and instead he's being the worst through that very action. This is that tragic elements of character that the Greeks developed and refined the art of tragedy specifically to try to highlight for us. And if you don't know your daimon, if you don't know your character, then you don't understand your circumstances. And you could have a life of success and victory and public acclaim and pride and all those other things, and yet still it could all come apart late in the game when suddenly the curtain is pulled back to reveal that all the victories turn out to be tragedies, right? This is the Oedipus example, and it's why Sophocles starts the play where he does, at the point of victory, because anybody up until that moment would have said, here is a winner he must have a eudaimon. He must have a daimon that's healthy and working for his best benefit. He must, because how else could he have risen so far from such humble beginnings? But this is part of Greek skepticism that comes out of and not cynicism, but skepticism that comes out of their tradition of seeing character and fate related the way that they do, which is, I can't remember, it's maybe somebody will remember, I can't remember who actually said the line, count no man happy until he's in the grave. And they don't mean it's good to be dead. They mean even up to the last moments, you don't know if some hidden part of somebody's character is suddenly going to reveal itself and turn all of the victories into a defeat. The story is still being told as long as we're alive. We're still unfolding. And conversely, although it doesn't get quoted as much, the same is true in reverse. Somebody might seem like they're having the worst possible life, but it's just because their moment hasn't come yet when, they're going to save 100 lives at a critical moment or whatever the thing is that's going to happen. Their story is still unfolding. And in all of this, the Greeks have this idea that although a human being is finite, the character that rules over us is infinite. Thus, the realm of a daimon, an infinite being. And thus Heraclitus says, you couldn't discover the limits of the soul even if you searched all your life, such is its profundity. It's like a human being, the story of a human life, however obvious it might seem at the moment, has plenty of depth in it to surprise us with. So this is kind of what he's talking about here.
So I want to follow up on something that you just said,
Please.
Because the question I have is, did the Greeks ever allow for the fact that this eudaimon and daimon is always under construction?
Yes, exactly. It's an organism. It's growing. It's learning. Yeah, it's changing. It's changing. And that's where they saw the realm of free will coming into play, right? The extent to which you learn about your character and then become a collaborator in gardening and tending to your character and cultivating it, that allows you to change what would have been the arc of your fate. And now your fate points in your teleology, the impulses of your character now point in a different direction because your character is different. Yeah. That's how they saw the relationship between free will and determinism.
Okay, right. Now we're in.
But it comes down to one of your favorite themes, which is in order to have free will, you have to take individual responsibility for your character. Right? To the extent to which we point the finger at others and blame fate and anything but ourselves is the extent to which we are agreeing to be passive and helpless pawns of our character. If we want to, and then we don't have free will, we're just symptoms of whatever our character happened to be. If we want to have free will, we have to become co-authors. And that means that we have to become explorers and study this vast, complicated realm of character and try to learn how does it work. And so, although he never says it per se, he alludes to it in the fragments we have left. Heraclitus basically is saying, if you want to be a philosopher, if you want to have some freedom and some free will, you're going to have to spend your whole life not only learning about the world around us, nature, the external nature, but you're going to have to also spend your whole life exploring the world inside of us, your own personal nature, because it's also an infinity. And it's the thing that's going to determine whether you develop any free will and become an individual or not. Yeah. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
So Phil, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it's actually a follow-up of your discussion with Sharon. Because I think the problem with human beings is that we exist in this sort of emergent contact with the existential world. We have contact with that, and as a living being, it sort of prods around and get to understand that. But in order to also become fully human, we have to somehow migrate that plodding around and feeling the world and migrate it to a conceptual understanding of ideas, which is essentially what is internalizing it, the otherness that's outside, into ourselves. And that's a slow process that, in a sense, it's a tactical thing before it could become kind of strategic understanding, which is a kind of logic. I'll put it that way. But the relationship between the two is really a kind of a funny pre-understanding, which is intuition. And I had this disagreement. I was trying to study the Bhagavad Gita with some Indian guy. There was a group of us who were Westerners, and we went through. I was rather patient. We went through the chants and all that, which is sort of like, okay, this is what we have to do. We'll go through it. And then it came to like a very decisive moment. This is a very important moment, by the way. And I'll broadly accept that maybe I didn't understand the depth of it, but to the degree that I understood it, that was the decisive moment when Krishna came down as a helper to Arjuna, right? Who's the prince. He's fighting, let's say, the other group. And that was the transition of one period to another, because previous to that period, I think this was the eighth manifestation of Krishna, of the great God Vishnu. Okay, the eighth transformation before that was Rama. In the era of Rama, the reality is big fish eat little fish. That is actually what the cosmos is, okay? And when Krishna came down, he was helping him, of course, once again, tactically, Arjuna is fighting the enemy on the other side. But within that enemy was many of his friends, even his relatives. So he was kind of sweating it. Because on the one hand, as a soldier, they wronged him, and he's supposed to fight. but he doesn't want to hurt them or kill them, right? It's like he has developed some sort of consciousness of otherness within his mind. And of course, Krishna tell him, but you're a warrior. You don't understand the greater dimensions of the world. The job of the warrior is to fight. I will help you, right? Don't think about these higher orders. That's only for the gods. I actually, at that point, told the leader, I said, the gods don't understand a damn thing about human beings or the damn thing at all. He should go back to heaven and tell Vishnu, like, hey, wait a minute, there's something going on there. They all develop a kind of empathy and consciousness about the other. Maybe we should tell, Shiva not to beat his drums yet. Let's see if we could let this happen. But he didn't. And so the leader tried to explain to me, in his way, how one does not understand certain things and one should just obey what the system is. And I got very angry and I accused him of, let's say, instead of going back to heaven and telling, a consciousness has arrived, he was trying to justify the caste system by saying, you're a warrior, just obey the orders, right? And it raised a kind of ruckus. I mean, a lot of other people, of course, were Westerners, also disagree with him, and he disbanded the whole group. I guess he couldn't face us. And so I'm perfectly willing to believe that I don't understand the system, but I think there is a problem in that, is because on the one hand, we are beings that are kind of, in some sense, bottom up, but we also have a lot of top down. And so we are constantly equivocating between, like, how do we relate the bottom up stuff with the top down stuff and make sense of it? And I think that's where the problem, because the top down would say, just follow the rules. The bottom up says, whoa, wait a minute. Like, my intuition tells me otherwise. There's something funny going on, and I'm relating it back to what is it? The Guns of August. What's his name? Robert Tuckman's Guns of August, right? There's a funny relationship between bottom up and top down. The Germans are very detailed people, right? Before World War I started, before they entered the war, they had accounted for every boxcar in Germany. They knew exactly where it was, how it's going to move to the front and so forth. And I remember reading that part in which, the column of soldiers will sweep across Europe, and the last soldier will have his sleeve brushed gently against English Channel and sweep across, right? It was just a very, very well-organized top-down structure. And when it happened and when they faced the enemy, it's like Mike Tyson says, everything's going fine until you get punched in the face.
Right? Everyone has a plan.
They're like, oh, wait a minute, it's not working. And the field officers were, phoning back to the central command saying, it's not working the way we planned. And of course, the top down says, you will follow the order because it's a perfect plan. And as it turned out, it wasn't so perfect after all. So I think that is something that we have to learn. One thing about the Russian army that's is very interesting, I found out from the very beginning, is they don't have sergeants. They do not have the interlocutor between top down and bottom up.
Yeah.
That's a real problem, because what controls the enlisted men? The lieutenants, right? Not the sergeants. That middle relationship was a very important communication between top down and bottom up. And I think that as human beings, we exist in this middle place, the middle kingdom. I don't mean China. I mean the middle earth. That's better. In which we are beings that are both top down and bottom up. And we have to accept that as the state that we are. We equivocate between top and bottom.
Can't just be one or the other.
Yeah, not just one or the other.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
that's why I want to say, in regard to your discussion with Sharon and yourself, a very important discussion. Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, next up is Joseph. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So, I mean, the question that I have, and it's gets to the heart of what Phil was talking about as well, with Christian and Arjun, is that I guess how would Kenneth define cultivating your character? What are some of the practical actions? Because they can mean different things to different people, on how to essentially determine. So for in Hinduism, it's your dharma, right? So that's how you're cultivating it. The Greeks may have done it differently. Some people are even stick to rational thinking, as we've heard a critique of many times. And so I guess in a practical sense, I'm trying to think of how do you cultivate your own personal character, or how would Kenneth probably answer that question? Just I mean, it's kind of, because it almost can be, it depends on your philosophy that you subscribe to, right? And that it should include nature. I mean, that's what we've been talking about here, and not necessarily adhering to the primacy of human beings or the human mind, or and what we can see and feel or and think, but in a more concrete way, because I end up being a little bit more concrete than most individuals, which I'm not proud of. I'm trying to think more abstractly and become more macro. But I was just curious to know how he would possibly answer that question, or if you could give us some maybe insights into that. So like, would he manage himself to the cardinal virtues? Would he look, how would he approach it as far as in a practical sense?
Well, my goodness, Joseph, what a question. He and I have never had that conversation. Certainly he talks about this a lot, and we've had the conversation through that angle. But as if you're asking the Lenin's question, what is to be done? What exactly are we to do in engaging in this? That's not a conversation I've had with him about it. I mean, certainly exploring your own character, getting to know it, exploring the things that you're good and bad at, and getting to know that, learning a lot of things about a lot of different subjects. All of these are on the to-do list, and learning to be a self-critic. Above all, the hardest thing that he focuses on is this problem of not letting yourself be seduced either by the power, the experiential dualic power of naive gnosis, nor the sort of abstract intellectual power of noesis, so that you either become an intellect, either to neither a doulos nor a benausos be is almost more of a challenge. I mean, it's more of a challenge than most moderns can manage anyway. So he focuses on that as one of the main things. If you can break free of those twin addictions, then you can develop Vernunft, the kind of mature gnosis and noesis working together. And that will just open up all kinds of possibilities for you as a person. But more tangibly than that, I haven't had that. Well, what about you, Donald? Have you had that conversation with Kenneth over the years?
Only to be rebuked.
Tell us about that.
No, I'm more like a dim-witted, somewhat. I don't know, but I think he points in this as much as he ever does. Recognize that you're not the end of creation. That if you read what he's saying just in this chapter, what human nature starts with, it's try and overcome those difficulties. Try and just even see that you have these blindnesses. Until then, you're deluded. It's kind of like it's kind of like what Stephen was pointing to earlier. Where the question is only what I want, because that's not what should I want, but this is what I want, because that's the start of all utilitarianism or pragmatism. It's just a question of using reason to get what you pre-existingly want without ever calling into question those basic motivations, desires, and wants. And he said that in almost every paragraph. Why does he keep saying it would not be better if men got what they want? Because men don't know what they should want. And that's sort of, until you accept that, you're wandering in the desert, or whatever. But the kind of things he's ever said is, I have some dim clue as to what's important. He's never said, well, us fellow philosophers,
Right.
or amongst us Aristoi, it's keep working at it. You're doing a little better. You now see some issues where you didn't see any issues before. It's more continuing to bring things into into question. I got a phone that I can't
You
shut
do
up.
that, and I'll take over.
Yeah. No, it's a spam. It's labeled spam, so I just trying to shut it off. But and seeing the water, you're the fish.
Learning to see the water.
You're all the unseen things. Kind of Hegel's the great teacher of that. Or picked up by Heidegger. Try to learn to think what's unthought in your epoch, in your civilization, in your life. What is it that you don't think about? And I'm pretty conventional. Apart from this Monday afternoon, once a week, I'm more like Phil says. I've bought in. Really, the great hero in Plato for me somewhat is the old guy in the beginning of the Republic. What is his name? Cerberus. No, I can't
Work around
think
the
of it.
name.
Yeah, and it means whatever, who's like, well, now that I've gotten old, I have enough money, I pay my debts, I can treat people honestly because I can afford to. I have no need to lie or steal or cheat. And so I don't, you know, pretty conventional. And I wonder if maybe I shouldn't have tried to think of something better for myself. I should have, you know, written down something or whatever. I don't know. Yeah, Kenneth, but I would say, learn to think the unthought, right from Hegel or
Yeah.
I don't know. He doesn't ever talk about Heidegger, but Hegel he talks plenty about. That's what I would think he would say, and he says it's the things you don't think about that are going to get you.
Yep. And now we're back to Gleipnir. So on that note, you know, I'd say the key thing is that it's, you know, to do the right thing is a dialectical relationship, because partly it's about what should be done and partly it's about what should not be done. What should you be struggling to avoid? And so Donald's talking in part about what you're struggling to avoid. You don't want to be a prisoner of your desires. You don't want to be a prisoner of the thoughts you have never thought consciously, you know, so that you're stuck in intellectual tracks. And in all of this, there's a noetic bent, which is half of the picture. You know, the Vernunft that we strive for, that we want to cultivate, that we wish the modern world would let us engage in. The hallmark of an Aristos is that you are using both your gnosis and your noesis. And so, you know, the part of the goal is to set the noesis in a dynamic relationship with the gnosis, so that you're a critic of your own tendency towards idiotia. Where am I too focused on my own things, my own experiences, my own wants, my own ideologies? Where are the places? And in my own life, when I find a thinker or a situation that jars me out enough that suddenly I turn and look and realize that I've been on a track that I didn't even know I was on, and that I'd never examined it properly, I chortle. I have a little bit of, I have a Kenneth Smith moment. I snicker to myself and say, oh, what do we have here? Here I thought I was living this awakened life. And meanwhile, right down the middle of my life, this part of my life I just had never examined until today. It just never occurred to me that was even a thing I could ask questions about. So there's this noetic side that we associate with philosophy. But I think Donald would agree that Kenneth would be the first to say that philosophy, true philosophy, has to draw on the gnosic as well, the experiential. You know, there's a reason why he goes back to Nietzsche over and over and over and over. He's like, you can't just be living a stale, dry life of thinking and journaling. You got to be, you want to find the things that turn you on and make you alive. What are the, you know, how can you be healthy and vital? This was Nietzsche's preoccupation, right? He wants the dancing philosopher, not you know, not the other kind. And Kenneth Smith talks about this a lot. He has a parable in which he describes an encounter with one of his heroes, who was an early teacher of his, who had that vitalist streak out of Nietzsche. And it's only at the end of the parable that you discover his teacher's dead, and it's his ghost speaking to him, because when he was alive, he was so full of life that even death can't kill him. The idea of him is so hearty and full of inspiration to want to go out and, you know, eat the juices of life, to want to, you know, really engage with the world, that even dead, he's a more profound impact on Kenneth's life than any number of live academicians. You know, that there is this desire to find what brings you to life, so that you can not neglect the gnosic side of yourself, which is what distinguishes a Benausos from an Aristos. And as part of that, I think about that discussion we had about a month ago about the difference between ancient Greek education and modern education, where now we're trying to channel everybody into, you know, the recipe to make you productive. or to get good grades for the school or whatever their noetic goal is. But where the goal in ancient Greek was only that in part, because in part it had to be to expose you to a lot of different things, because you don't know where your arete is going to turn out to be. Or do you have a secret gift for music, unsuspected? You know, that until you actually put your fingers on a keyboard and fall in love with it, you don't know that this is the great thing that you could become. Is it running? Is it, gardening? Is it, always thinking of the right thing to say to someone who's sad that helps them to, rediscover their connection to life? People have, multifarious gifts, most of which they never discover. And the Greeks thought that the key to life for an individual and a civilization was to find those aretes, those potential capabilities in people, and give them the opportunities to cultivate them and bring them out to become the gifts that they can give to humanity. My experience is when you find those things in yourself, they energize you. You suddenly, your spirit dilates and fills with energy, because that's part of the nutrition you've been missing all your life up until then. The nutrition for your character, for your soul. And when you find it, you're nourishing yourself. So that part, that vitalist part, is every bit as important as the critiquing part. You can basically want to pursue both back and forth at the same time. And that the result is that you will grow into a shape nobody could have predicted at the outset, and that no prescriptive systematic philosophy would ever have found for you. Something that has to be discovered, if that makes sense. It's part of why he's so cagey about not telling people what they should do, is because he doesn't want to become a noetic systematizer. He wants to encourage people to do that, to explore that relationship of somathesy that's going to allow them to discover their unique arete, that's going to make them somebody that's unlike anybody who's ever been. You know what I mean? So answering but not answering at the same time. There's a between Donald and me, there's our stab at it.
Well, there's no orthodoxy of Kenneth Smith to remember.
Right.
It's not aphorisms. It's always, we talk about that. It's the pointing. You either see the example in the world or you don't. Remembering that the good man always does this doesn't help you or anyone else.
But then you watch a good man do something and you're like, there it is. It can be done. I want to do it now. Even if it's not that thing, I want to be the person who helps. Yeah. You know what? I think that you should write that question down and not forget it, because we will eventually, David and Donald and I, we will eventually get Kenneth onto these calls sooner or later. And when we do, he's going to say, what questions do people have? And I want you to bring that right back out and pose it to him. I think you'll crack him up.
I definitely will. I mean, I have an idea, and you guys have given me, the framework, how to think about it. I have an idea, but it's just almost concretizing it to a point. There is no formula, to tell you the truth. There's not going to be that formula.
Right.
But yeah, I definitely plan on hopefully at one point to pose that question, and just so it's much more simplistic for me I'm a much more simplistic thinker sometimes.
Aren't we all? All right, Sharon, then Phil, and Stephen. Go ahead, Sharon.
So Rick and Donald, I really like that, because I also have another question. I think that whatever character subtype you are, the foundation of human existence is experience, right? And from you make mistakes, you get experience, you develop judgment, and from that comes wisdom. And that experience, until you hit your grave, is open-ended and unfinished. And it's that whole process of evolution. As you said, you develop your arte, that gives you joy. And as a young kid, one of the things my dad taught me is that if you continue to learn, you will have joy in life because it's an exciting place. And so I was always very, very excited to do the things that I knew nothing about. I went to business school when I was pretty close to 40.
Yeah.
And the people in the class looked around at me, what's this doctor doing here? But it was the most exciting time of my life.
Yes.
It was nothing I'd ever learned. So I think the engagement is critical for a continuous experience. And I find it not sad, but I find it exciting.
Yes.
For me, there's no pathos there, human existence. It just depends on what your engagement is. And I don't know how to express all of this philosophically. And I don't know who is the one that said that the human experience is open-ended and unfinished. I don't know which philosopher said that, but probably someone did.
Yeah.
But I think that's pretty interesting. And it kind of ties together what you said, Donald and Joseph.
Thank you, Sharon.
Now?
Phil and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you, Sharon, for what you said. You're even more adamant than I am. You know, like, I want to go back in this relationship between the visible and the invisible. I think throughout my life, that has been a passion to uncover the invisible as much as I could to my abilities. And I think art had taught me that. And I've always discovered, and this is different from Sharon, that confronting the invisible was always a little bit sort of unnerving and disturbing. And yet you force yourself to do it. And I think I'll bring in, you know, one of the quotes from, you know, I guess Jesus: the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. I think that's true. I notice within myself, and I'm not condemning myself for saying this, that as you get older, somehow gravity just weighs you down. And I find it a little bit more and more difficult to seek out the invisible because of this sort of, like, how should I say, discomfort. I've always, when I was younger, found that when I feel a little too comfortable, I know it's time to, like, push harder. As I get older, I find it a little bit more difficult. This is a confession of my own, okay? I'm still there pushing, but I'm feeling like, you know, I'd like to enjoy the food that I enjoy. And not try, like, every time go out and say, let's just try something new. And say, oh God, that was terrible, you know, and all that kind of stuff, you know. So my aptitude for taking risks has lessened. And I think that has something to do with just being weighted down so consistently that it's just harder and harder to get up. And so I think it is fortunate, and I'm speaking outside of myself because that's not necessarily good. It is fortunate that we end up dying because I think I could imagine if I get to be, let's say, 500 years old, it would just weigh me down so much that I could not even roll out of bed. You know, like, instead of like, oh, let's just push harder. Oh no, come on now. I push hard enough, you know, and it's like, it's kind of like, you know, it's time for me to relax and let the young people do it and just give me the rewards of what they've done because I've done that for them earlier. It's like, so I admire what you say, Sharon, but I sort of disagree that I find that struggle gets harder and harder as you get older and older. Just simply because the weight of gravity just to like stand up. I find myself having more trouble walking downstairs even these days than walking upstairs. I used to think like, what are these old people complaining about, like moving out to a flat? You know, like it's just incomprehensible. You just walk it up, you know, and then if it's hard struggle, and then I find that, you know, they did have something to say. And I didn't understand that until I got to the point like, yeah, it's getting harder. And I imagine that, you know, like 10 years from now, it'll be really hard, right? And so I apologize for getting older and older. But, you know, that's why I look forward to, you know, younger people taking over, because I believe that the future belongs to them, you know? And so in that sense, I am not as adverse to, let's say, relinquishing my leadership, if you want to put it that way, simply because I just know my limitations are that it's just harder and harder to get up in the morning. You know, it's not impossible. Now, I'm not giving up in that sense, but it is. I notice my measurements is like, okay, yeah, it's time for a little bit of comfort. And I hate to say that, but nonetheless, that's true. And what I find disturbing, by the way, is that all the time that I was teaching, you know, until I was 65, rarely have I found a class of 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds that are pushing harder than myself, you know, who is in the 60s. And that's disturbing. When the younger generation of a civilization becomes more complacent than the old age people, that is terrifying to me. So I'll just say it that way. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Can
Phil.
I just say something for
Of course.
Phil?
Of course. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
sure.
So Phil, I must admit, I'm 70 years old now. And the older you get, it does take more maintenance.
Yeah.
But that's part of your engagement.
Yeah.
I walked 4 miles this morning. I do that every other day.
Yeah.
Because I have to, because I just must. Because if not, something happens to my soul. In fact, I've been sick for the last 6 months. And even though I've been ill, I've gotten out there and walked because I just must. And then the other thing I want to say is, as you get older and older, I have said in this forum that I subscribe to the Christian faith. And one of the things that Paul, or in 1st and 2nd Timothy says, for God has not given you a spirit of temerity, but of power and love and self-discipline. And until you die, that's your mantra. At least that's my mantra.
Okay, Sharon, I'm going to pull rank on you. Wait till you're 75. Okay. I'm going to pull rank on you. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. You don't know.
I'll still be going. I assure you. I'm done. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. This is great. You know, and part of what's uncovered by this discussion is this truth that you can't always be on the edge and you can't always be comfortable. Both extremes lead to unhealthiness. And so we find ourselves having to have a dialectical relationship between comfort and self-challenge. And it means that like the way that the blood moves through the body in pulses rather than in a steady stream, that's what it has to be like for us as we explore what we've not explored before. Is that there are times when there's times to do that, and then there's times to rest and recover. And it's got to be the way it goes. That's the life of an organism, right? That's what it's like to be us. Yeah. So I'm basically going to say I'm with both of you on this one. And you see that with Kenneth in his own life too, right? I mean, he's not always at the prime of his powers. He has he actually has a parable called The Maven Out of Tune, where a guy who's called upon by people all over the world for his wisdom and the amazing things, advice that he can give, is about to go on when he says, "Oh, nope, I'm not going to do it." And his handler says, "Well, what do you mean you're not going to do it? They've all come here to hear from you." He says, "No, they came to hear from me at the peak of my powers. But today I know I'm not at the peak of my powers, and they'd be better off without me." And the guy says, "Well, how do you know you're not at the peak of your powers?" And he says, "Well, my hair's out of place." He says, "Nobody cares if your hair's out of place." He says, "Yeah, but if I were at the peak of my powers, I wouldn't care if my hair was out of place. The fact that I looked in the mirror and was distracted and forgot what I was thinking shows that my brain is disordered right now, and I'm in no fit condition to be the person at my peak. So, I need to go rest and relax, and we'll try this another time." And this is the human condition. We have a saying like this in programming too, which Donald will know some variant of, which is, when you're young and you're just getting started, you think that that programming is a test and you're supposed to prove how smart you are, and you want to write this tricky, clever code, and then you want to show it to your friends who are also programmers and baffle them and say, "Ha ha, I understand a thing you don't understand." And it's like, well, that's all well and good until the first time you're called in at 3 a.m. and as an emergency to fix the code. And at 3 a.m, you are not at the peak of your powers, especially not if you didn't know you were going to be called in at 3 a.m. You only went to bed a few hours ago, and you were at a party and drinking, and now you have a hangover. He says, so what you learn is you don't write for the guy who's at the peak of his powers. You should never write for him. You should write for the you at 3 a.m. who's hungover and sleep deprived. And so the advice that they boil this down as is, no matter how smart you are, you should be writing baby code. Write the babyest baby code you can that anybody could read and understand. And if you do, you will never find yourself at 3 a.m. go, who wrote this crap? How am I supposed to fix this? When it's your own code, you'll go, oh, I see. Okay, now I can fix it. Sharon, go ahead, and then we'll go on, Stephen.
May I tell a story?
Please.
So one night I get called in, and it's 1 a.m. And the nurse tells me the patient is 101. And I go, really? What are we doing? She says, we're putting in a pacemaker. I said, all right. So I get in there and I expect to see somebody that's decrepit. And I walk into the room, and this guy about 5'4" looks at me. He says, what's up, doc? I said, okay, so what are we doing here? He says, well, I was playing tennis this evening and I passed out. I forgot to change my battery. And while we waited for the battery to come, because it's 1 o'clock in the morning, we had the most engaging conversation. 101. He had come down here, had retired from New York. They had put him in one of the nursing homes, his kid. He sold it, bought a State Farm business, ran it for 20 years. So I said, what do you do now? He says, I'm a greeter in Walmart. Just goes to show you, 101. I'll never forget him. And he didn't look like he was going to check out anytime soon.
Yeah.
He got his battery and he was out.
Nice.
So there you go, 101.
Thank
and
you,
he was thin. He was playing tennis. He looked fit. He's a Floridian.
Hey, Sharon, stop retorting me what a surrogate 101 person rather than I'm talking about you and me. I'm pulling rank, and you're pulling rank by introducing a surrogate.
I'm trying to inspire you by telling you what's possible.
Yeah.
Look, nobody will
Exactly.
out-talk me. So if you want to just talk, that's fine. But please don't let me have to lift weights and all that kind of stuff.
Well, on this inspiring note, let's call on Stephen, who's been waiting.
Thank you for letting me tell my story, Rick. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Sharon.
Stephen, tell us about it.
Okay, we mentioned Nietzsche. Now, it often occurred to me that it might have been Nietzsche's project to do a certain thing. and this doesn't really seem to be generally picked up. People are saying, Nietzsche's saying this, Nietzsche's saying that, as if he himself personally proposes that idea. And I'm not too sure of that. I get the impression, you've got Dostoevsky as well. And what are they trying to say? And a big part, I get the feeling, a big part of what they're trying to say is they're holding up a mirror to 19th century civilization. You guys have, say, you're Christians. You've built houses for the God everywhere. And you keep on saying, we would love nothing better than our God to show up, so we would welcome him and get him to sit on his throne, the high altar. And we would love that. And well, Dostoevsky says that's the appearance. And this whole 19th century civilization says we love every opinion of Jesus Christ. He's the ultimate. He's wonderful. And Nietzsche seems to be taking that point of Dostoevsky in his own way when he says, Jesus is an idiot. And this 19th century culture was shocked. But I get the feeling what Nietzsche was trying to say is that's what your real view is. You build all these temples to your God. You say you're going to welcome him in. And you say that his values are your values, but really, no, by your standards, Jesus is a fool. If he showed up, well, Dostoevsky said if he showed up, the authorities would grab him, put him in prison and kill him. And Nietzsche's saying, well, it won't be that bad. They'll disregard him and perhaps lock him up in an insane asylum. So Nietzsche's holding up the mirror and pointing out the ironies. He's always pointing out these ironies about 19th century civilization, which was so fabulously in love with itself. And of course, we have to think of the other moderns, 20th and 21st century, who are so fabulously, in certain ways, in love with themselves and say, we profess this. This is our set of values. But Nietzsche would hold up a mirror and say, no, I see a scary monster there. What's going on, guys? What's your real trip? You keep on telling me you're wonderful and you believe in all these things, but you're doing something very different, and your real motives are something very different. And there is another point I would like to make, and that's where people talk about individuals. This individual did this, it's great, and I as an individual want to do that, it's great. And the message that Kenneth Smith is pointing out here, that you, the individual, is probably several different people. It's not just the other people out there or the other characters that you have to worry about. You yourself are limited in a certain way too. That, oh, I'd like to be this, I'd like to be that, I'd like to be the other thing, but actually you can't follow all these different trends, even though the modern world just offers you so many different temptations. People can concentrate on sort of one sort of personality. They can't be all the personalities, yet they have several secret personalities buried within them, such as the diamond. This is overlooked all the time. Everybody, everywhere I see is talking about, I, the one person, and there's the world. No, sorry, guy, you're several different people. Kenneth Smith is pointing this out here. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, it's part of what's interesting about this model of character as daimon is this concept that there is a lot of complexity involved in saying the word I, right? Even claiming to be an individual, we take it for granted because it's familiar to us as the most familiar of pronouns. And yet in truth, according to the ancients, the I is among the most complicated things there is. So who are we? I think it's, yeah, it's a Nietzsche quote, right? Who has done the work? Who has put in the work that they dare feel comfortable using the pronoun I? You know, who can claim that they have searched themselves well enough to be able to say with confidence who that person is that they're referring to? And you know, he's running with the Genothi Seauton in part there. But let's go back to our text here. So here's the second half of the next to last paragraph in section E, picking up where we left off. And we're I think looking at the time, I dare say the thing I dare say for the last 3 weeks, which I think will make it to the end of section E today. But let's see if that's true. As moderns, we naively imagine that fate crushes individual resistance from without. Right? We think that's what fate is. Fate is the author writing the end of the book ahead of time, and now you're stuck with it. That's what we think as moderns. But the ancients didn't think that, right? The Greeks understood the issues far more subtly. Fate works on us precisely by our incapacity to recognize and resist it. And this goes to Joseph's question. What ought we to be doing? How are we supposed to proceed? And if it's true that we lack freedom and we are fated to the extent to which we don't know our own character, so that it acts upon us and we're just helpless symptoms of it, then by that ipso facto, the extent to which we want to become an individual and have freedom, you know, it's multiplied by the extent to which we learn our character and remove those blind spots, so that we can understand what it's likely to lead us to do, so that we can make choices about the things that up until that moment we always did automatically, not realizing it was even a choice. We just took it for granted. So kind of there is this extent to which, you know, one of the part of the program that he's setting us on is to find the lacunae in our view of the world. Where are the empty spots where something actually is, but to us it looks like there's nothing there? And that includes the impulses within ourselves to notice or not notice, to want or not want, to do or not do. Where are those patterns so that we can make some choices about them? That's what's going to open up, you know, freedom for ourselves. He says it works on us through what we want and cannot self-criticize to dissociate ourselves from. Right? So we're trapped within the character that we're born with only to the extent that we don't know that it's there. As we learn that it's there, then we can begin to dissociate ourselves from it. That is the Hegelian dialectic in which we develop Verstand out of Begriff by negating the parts of the Begriff that we don't like, that we don't care for. It only works because we are perceiving the parts of our life that we don't like. We're capable of rejecting them because we're aware of them. But if we're never aware of them, we can't reject them. They're everywhere. They're the water we swim in, and we don't know that that's even a thing we can choose. So this is what he's saying here. You can't self-criticize until you can see something enough to realize that it's a thing that you could have choices about. And that's how it is with the landscape of your own character. Now, he's not an ultra individualist. He's not saying that there's no cult, there's no constraints on us from without, right? He's not saying the ancients thought that either. And nature is there outside of us as well, acting upon us. And our culture and our family and our neighborhood, they're also putting up barriers and setting constraints. But the same approach to our own character applies to those things as well, right? We don't learn to criticize the naive patriotism of youth until we learn to see our country as it actually is, instead of as our slogans say that it is. So until we know the difference between, for example, the United States as it actually is, as opposed to the United States of, you know, anthems and slogans, we don't even have the option of separating ourselves from it and saying, well, what if I wanted to choose differently? What if I wanted to critique it and hold it accountable and ask it to be better? Yeah, learning from the action of self-accountable, says Lisa, right on the money, right? See your actions and understand how I played a part. So you learn to bring into visibility these taken for granted things. This is where Hegel comes in again, right? Whatever is familiar to us is for that reason not recognized for what it truly is. Hegel's talking about this same issue, that you have no freedom to make choices about things that are overly familiar because we learn to take them for granted. And that's true about our own character. It's true about our religion. It's true about our nation. It's true about anything unexamined in our lives. Thus Socrates and the unexamined life. The reason to examine is not because it's so good if we get in charge of everything, right? Stevens talked about the liabilities of wanting, the liabilities of our will, and the dangers of the law of unintended consequences. But we can't even choose whether or not to intervene if we aren't aware the thing is there in the first place. So bringing into consciousness, turning the mind's eye to look at the things it has learned not to notice is what creates the opportunity to choose whether or not to engage, whether or not to change something, whether or not to critique it, to evaluate it, and to choose whether or not to go along with it or to deviate from it. This is what he's talking about here. This is what he's saying the ancients took for granted because they understood character as a daimon, because they understood it as this invisible governing force behind us that we had to learn to turn and face. This is a model of human freedom and character that invites philosophical investigation, whereas the modernist model, that we're all just machines and our brain is just a computer and it just does what it's told and everything is obvious, tells us not to bother looking because we must already know ourselves, right? It's just a program. We program ourselves, we're free, and so, ta-da, we're done. Right out of the bat, the modern model of individual consciousness assumes that there's no need to investigate any further, whereas the ancient model of human consciousness assumes that there is a driving, pressing need to investigate further, lest one become, the proper subject of a comedy or a tragedy because of one's character acting out on oneself. So this is the role that Section E is playing in Chapter 4 in trying to help us to understand the difference between the ancient worldview and the modern worldview. Is this core question of, are we being invited by our assumptions, the assumptions of the worldview of our epoch, to question ourselves, or are we being invited to be complacent and take ourselves for granted? And what are the consequences of those two different orientations? Sharon and then Phil. Go ahead, Sharon.
I missed this. Did you read the other sentence? Fate works on us precisely by our incapacity. Fate works on us precisely by our incapacity to recognize and resist it. It works on us through what we want and cannot self-criticize to dissociate ourselves from.
That's right.
Fate works the innermost forces within us, the drives and presuppositions which we mistakenly assume are our own purest self, but what we understand least of all and are most readily betrayed. And I want to piggyback on something that Stephen said. I hope I heard it correctly, where he said that we're several people, we're several persons over a lifetime. Is that what you said? Is that I got to interpret? Because
yeah,
I want to put forth this concept that I don't think we're as fated, and it's not as grim as that. I think our experience of free will in the past, right, helps determine our fate.
Yeah, it's a dialectical relationship.
Dialectical, you call it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's a process of evolution.
Yeah.
And so when he states here, where am I? Fate works on us precisely by our incapacity to recognize and resist it. I think fate works on us, but it's through the process of our free will, of us exercising our free will. Tell me if I'm off base or I don't understand it.
No, you're
But
right.
it
That's the
seems that
compliment,
way.
right? That's the complement of that sentence. You're absolutely right.
Yes.
That if fate works on us precisely by our incapacity to recognize and resist it, then our freedom becomes possible precisely through developing the capacity to recognize and resist what would otherwise be our default behavior.
Okay.
Right? This is where the real sophistication of this Greek model comes into play. That the exact same thing that dooms us to a certain outcome if we don't learn and don't cultivate the ability to change ourselves also enables us to get a different outcome if we do cultivate the ability to recognize and resist that default. It shows the extent to which the Greek concept of fate arising in part from within, and this concept of self-authorship, these result in an entirely different concept of fate and freedom than a more medieval approach where someone knows everything and has written the end and therefore it doesn't matter what we do. This is exactly the opposite. It says it really matters what we do. You know, this is what makes it existentialist, right? That the actual process of the experience of going through life and making the choices we make and noticing the things we notice, and as Kenneth would say, not noticing the things we don't notice, all of this has to come together to figure out where we're going to end up. There's nothing written in a book ahead of time that says, you know, and then he caused a civil war and was the source of all bad things. The end, right? There's nothing like that written anywhere. We can shape ourselves, but the Greeks say we can't shape ourselves infinitely as though we are the New Testament God, right? Not the New Testament God, I guess I mean the Old Testament God. We can't shape ourselves like a divine, all-knowing, all-powerful will. We have to shape ourselves contingently, moment by moment, based on what we currently recognize and know how to do. And with that, if we do it carefully, we can expand a little bit that circle of what we're then able to recognize and know how to do next time. You know, we can, by working on developing our circle of freedom, you know, we can grow it and get more control over our lives and more power to make things come out in a healthier fashion. But this is core to the word dialectical is the concept of a dialogue, right? It's back and forth between the fatedness of the defaults established for us by our character and the freedom that could be established by our own learning to know our character and cultivating it to change. And, you know, then when we cultivate it and it changes, now we have a new set of defaults and a new fate that becomes where we would go unless we engage again in a dialogue with it. So iteratively, incrementally, adaptively, it'll grow and change like an organism. So I'm glad you pointed that out about that sentence, because it's part of the, you know, part of the implications of the way that Kenneth writes is he's often thinking about the converse of the sentences that he's saying. If he's talking about fate and how it rules us, then he's also trying to describe freedom and how it could help us, you know, I can't say escape that rule, but let's say educate and modify that rule, right? To equivocate between being the active and the passive.
Yes, Geneva, it is Kierkegaard. I'm reading Kierkegaard now.
Yeah. Yeah, the more you read Kierkegaard, the more you start to see him all over Kenneth Smith. You can tell that Kenneth Smith has read a lot of Kierkegaard. The quote that you did.
It's
right
not as sophisticated as you guys. It says it's for beginners and it's a comic. Thank David for that. I like comics now.
Oh yeah, I like that one. I don't have Kierkegaard for beginners yet. I have some of the other for beginners books. I'll get that one.
Oh, I better get that one. Yeah, the one I have is like way over my head.
Well, you know, Geneva, I'm struggling with that too. And then here.
Well, he's a challenge because, you know, he's a stylist and he's frequently writing sarcastically without telling you that's what he's doing. The fact that, like, in either or in other places, he frequently, instead of saying what's on Kierkegaard's mind, he says what's on this character's mind. And whether that's something you should trust or not depends on who that character is. And you know, is that a trustworthy character? Well, sometimes the untrustworthy one is the one telling you the reasonable things that he thinks make sense. And you're, as a reader, supposed to go, yeah, I don't think so. But, you know, what's your clue? How do you know which of these guys to trust and not trust? Kierkegaard is not all that concerned with whether you figure it out the first time through. It makes it tricky to read Kierkegaard. He's a
I was just going to say in reply.
You got to come off mute, Stephen. I found the echo. Bring yourself off mute and you'll be fine.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I was just going to say that we're several different people is not just revealed in the course of life. This is what I believe. I believe that there's like several resident selves. Just your brain alone is big enough to do it, that there's several different people there. And if there was an invisible man, this invisible man could come along and start having a conversation with one of these other selves. There are these other selves within you who are sleeping or dreaming, who have their own ideas, their own ambitions, and are playing a certain sort of game. They're all aware that they have to cooperate or you're in big trouble. They need to cooperate to a certain degree just to keep the persona, the mask, that you're one person going, because if you don't, you're in trouble. Now, I know people might think I'm a kook for saying this. I really do believe this, that you could split all the heads apart and you could have several heads on your shoulder, all having their own slightly different outlooks and their own perspectives and playing their own little game. People would condemn me as a kook for believing this and lock me up. But I think I've seen evidence of it.
Yeah.
You know, they talk about schizophrenia, for example. I would say schizophrenia is where that platform which keeps us together as a single mask, something's gone wrong there. And what we're seeing in these several different personalities is what's actually there all the time, only it stops being held together. Thank you.
There's abundant evidence. I mean, psychology as a science has put a lot of time and effort into this, and they've reached, you know, most threads of psychology have reached some variation on what you're saying as the conclusion about the structure of human consciousness. It's a lot more complicated than being a single unified I. And you can see evidence of it, you know, even in the Iliad or the Odyssey, when you see how the archaic Greeks, an idea occurs to them and they don't recognize that that's themselves saying that idea. And they say, well, Athena must have whispered in my ear, you know, and that's the way Homer writes. He's constantly saying, and then so-and-so, the goddess so-and-so spoke to them and told them this, and they went, oh, that's a good idea. But, you know, a modern would say, well, I think you were the one that had that idea. You're just a little concerned about the voice in your head, and you think that must be somebody else. And, you know, maybe, you know, a more complete solution is somewhere in between that says, just because it came out of your head doesn't mean it came out of a single identity, that, you know, people have multiple roles and personalities and personality fragments within them. That whatever's going on in here that makes us who we are is a lot more complicated than simply the letter I in a capital. And throughout our lives, there are plenty of times when that becomes clear. One of them is when we have different roles in our lives and we're at work. There's Donald, right, working, talking to his programming people like a programmer, and then he hangs up the phone and dials into this, and suddenly he's a philosopher. What the hell just happened? Where'd that guy come from? Well, there's more than one guy in there, right? I mean, there's a lot of Donalds. And I think that's true for all of us in more than just a arm-wavy metaphorical way. Zen Buddhism spends a lot of time struggling with this question of identity. And core to Zen Buddhism is this same idea that, you know, there's a lot of complexity to the nature of identity, and we would do well to treat it less as a simple, familiar, thought-turning cliche and more as a source of mystery and new questions. So
Well,
I'm glad you brought it up.
Explain those Indian gods with the multiple heads and multiple arms.
Right? Exactly. Phil, go ahead, and then we'll go back to the text.
Yeah, I have a simpler model than that in a way. It's because the model as the self is multiple because we contain otherness within ourselves. And that makes the easier transition between the self, which already has otherness, in relationship to the otherness that's external. I mean, the question it becomes is the matter of managing both the inner circle and the outer circle at the same time. And so the managerial process, you know, we all have to become managers in a sense, even though there are many tasks we have at hand. And this relationship with the otherness, this exterior, and incorporating into the interior, it's a very important thing. What happened is that some of the otherness is within yourself actually covers over other otherness that's within yourself. And so I remember experiencing this. I'll give you the background. I wrote a nice essay on that. It's called the Drive Through Transcendence. In 1988, it's debatable whether I was fired from Penn State or whether I just quit. I was up for, I think, promotion or tenure. I can't remember, or being in the tenure track. And because I didn't like what's going on in the department, I refused to turn in the material. So now, at which point, the dean eventually says, insofar as you did not turn in your material, we will have to relinquish you from our contract. So is that a firing, or is that because I initiated the firing? So in any event, I was jobless. And this was a very difficult situation. And so I was looking for a job. I happened to be driving down to North Carolina, looking for a job, because I had an interview there. It was in a school that I eventually didn't go to, and I actually didn't like the school. But nonetheless, since I was in North Carolina, and I've been there before because I was there as a visiting artist in 1981. And so I said, I've heard so much about the Blue Ridge Parkway. I never got a chance to see it while I was there. Several times I was in North Carolina. I said, this time I'm going to take the Blue Ridge Parkway back. I think the Blue Ridge Parkway is one of the most beautiful drives, perhaps in the world, certainly in the United States. It is not magnificent like, driving in the high mountains, although it was in the mountains. It was just the way the world was constructed. It was constructed during the WPA, in which people were put to work. And at that time, instead of bearing through a mountain, you just go along the landscape. It was driving through it, and the way it wind and weave through the landscape in a kind of rhythmic flow, it felt like music. And sometimes it was on one side of the mountain, sometimes on the other side, and sometimes at the tip of the mountain, so you could look at both sides. And it was just wonderful. But that was fine. What it reveals to me is, once again, the relationship between the visible and the invisible. I remember several times through the drive. This was, this was sort of, I guess, in early spring or something. And I remember we passed through highways. I had mistakenly thought it was the freeway, but nonetheless, it was really a highway. And even though it was one of the most beautiful drives in the world, during my whole trip to North Carolina and through Virginia, I was passing maybe, I don't think I passed any cars, but the cars going the other way, maybe there was only 2 or 3, very few. I was just amazed. And every time I looked when I cross or come close to another freeway, another highway, there was many, many cars. And I said, well, what is with these people? Well, they're living the efficient life. That's what these people would be. So it would take maybe an hour more, or 30 minutes more if they drove spend part of the time in the Blue Ridge Parkway. But they didn't, it's like, I'm just thinking like, well, I got to remember this. I'm not going to let myself be tricked by the efficient society to, in a sense, cover over the beauty of the otherness that's available. That's one of the reasons why I believe that, you don't have to go to Mount Machu Picchu. Beauty is all around you. You got to look for the invisibility. And part of the invisibility is you can't see it, but part of it, you can't see it because culture has covered it over. And so that was important. I said, I'll remind myself when I think about this every time that don't forget to look. Look at all the beauty that's available, hidden even in the places that you don't expect it to find. And, and in some sense, so you could internalize it. It becomes visible, And part of the problem, I think, I'll transition this back. I remind myself not to be like these other people, always to make room for that. But part of I'll go back to the Greeks, when they fought the wars against the Trojans. I remember Aeschylus wrote to play the Persians with the play. It was a warning to not become greedy and become an empire, because afterward they collect all these taxes, tribute from all the city states. They say, hey, this is pretty damn good. Why don't we just continue to be this, right? And forgetting the fact that, no, but there's these other states.
Right.
And I remember thinking to myself, and this was later on, thinking to myself, it was not necessarily to blame the Athenians for being greedy, though they were, and they were given warning to that. It was that there was no external models.
Mm-hmm.
Only one there was city-states and there was empires, right? And so even though they've experienced this thing, they didn't internalize the otherness of a possibility that had not existed. So they wanted to become the empire. That was the other model that was available. So it wasn't until, what's his name now? The Greek guy. I mean, the
Alexander,
right?
Yes.
He's a Macedonian. He's not a Greek.
Right.
He was the otherness that understood the otherness that was
the
internal.
Pan-Hellenic concept.
Probably through some influence by Aristotle.
Yeah.
It is important to have a relationship that, if otherness exists in relationship to a conflict with, let's say Persia had a conflict with another empire, another country, then in a sense you could see that there's resistance, but that resistance you could see is not the same as internalizing the otherness as a concept. You can say, oh, there's actually another way. So there is a relationship between what exists and what exists is in your mind.
Yes.
You have to internalize this.
Yes.
Have to be able to deal with the concept. Otherwise, you're just, once again, going from bottom up and not having the map from the top down. And so I think that I'm not going to apologize for the Greeks, I mean, for the Athenians. The Athenians, of course, they were also mesmerized by the propaganda of Pericles,
Yes.
who's quite an astonished speaker,
Yes.
and that was helpful for the how should I say, the political movement as well. So in some sense, they just fell into a tragedy. They never really internalized a concept that wasn't internalizable at that time. And so they fell under the problem. They could either remain a city-state which is, or they could become an empire. Hey, we want to get bigger. Let's become an empire. And they got a warning from Aeschylus.
But they were missing the other concept.
That's right. They were missing the concept, which
Yeah.
means pure experience itself is also not enough.
Yeah.
You also have to have the concept
Yeah.
that's internalized within the mind itself as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
I am willing to share. I'm willing to send that essay, the Drive to Transcendence, and you could distribute it if you want.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah, very much like to see that. Yeah, I've never driven on the Blue Ridge Parkway, so I know I'm
You got to do it. You got to do it.
And in return, I'll tell you, on the Pacific Coast, it's Highway 101 that runs the entire length of the Pacific Coast from Canada to Mexico, and it has that.
I drove quite a bit of
same-
it. That this is really, it's really not a more terrific scene, but it's just the way the movement. It's like a dance.
Yeah,
It's like dancing
yeah.
through the mountains.
Yeah,
It's like it's
I love
rhythmic.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the kind of what you're describing is definitely my jam. You know, I grew up hiking and camping in the Northwest. We drove so many of those little highways up, you know, winding through the mountains, having to couldn't just do a straight line through, you know, like a conqueror. It had to equivocate, right? It had to find its way. Partly setting the way and partly adapting. I love the feeling of driving on roads like that. They're marvelous. All right, well, let me take us to the final paragraph. I think we're ready for the final paragraph, section E. So this is the first half of it, and fair warning, this is before we dive into this. As the last paragraph of section E, I think we've established by now what he's doing in each of the sections in chapter 4 is that last paragraph. Its job is to pull together the previous sections as well as this section into a new statement. Right? He's trying to lift our understanding of the ancient worldview up another level. Oh yeah, the opening of The Shining, that road trip is fantastic. So as you're reading this sentence by sentence, don't just be reading it in terms of daimon and eudaimonia. You know, you also want to read it in terms of the previous sections. And I'll paste them in here again, just so that we have them in mind as we go through, right? So nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth was where we started. And then we went to custom and nature, aristocracy, and philosophy. After that, he built on top of that form and matter, organicism, and arete. And then section D was arete, or natural excellence. So all of that is what he's going to try to pull together now in this concept of daimon and eudaimonia in this final paragraph. So he says, the same archaic philosopher. Now, before we go on, if he's writing about Heraclitus, which he is, then he's thinking about the way that Heraclitus writes and his ability to condense so much information into so little space. And that means he's more self-conscious. Kenneth is more self-conscious writing this paragraph than any of the previous paragraphs in section E. Right? This is where he's trying to condense it down. He's actually naming the guy. So he's got it, well, he names it later in the sentence, but he's got the guy in his mind. So the word archaic here is to be read two different ways, right? Because of course he means pre-classical. That's the traditional definition of archaic when people are talking about Greece that most people would be thinking of. But that's not all he's talking about. He's talking about arche, right? Why is the word archaic used to apply to the early stages of a civilization? Because that's when a civilization is closest to its original founding principles that cause them to shear off from whoever they were before to become this new culture. They were driven by the impetus of close association with hypnotic, riveting, dynamic archai that possessed the people and made them say, we must go forth and do this new thing. So when we talk arche, we're talking like if you had been in the presence of Jesus when he's giving the Sermon on the Mount and your mind is just reeling at how revolutionary these ideas are. And you're going, yeah, we could totally live in this completely different way. This is this second sense of archaic. So when he's talking about Heraclitus being an archaic philosopher, what he's trying to say is, unlike later philosophers who are more sophisticated, who are more rhetorical, more rational, more trying to modify the way they say things to appeal to how they think you're reading and to the conventions of the culture. These earlier archaic philosophers are possessed by the arche, and they're desperate to transmit to you the power and magnetism of these ideas. And as a result, when we read them, they feel strange to us. They're not entirely speaking our language. And this is what he's getting at when he says, when he refers to Heraclitus as an archaic philosopher. Throughout the medieval period, they were always calling, and even in the Hellenistic late, post-classical period of the ancient era, they kept referring to Heraclitus as obscure, Heraclitus lo oscuro. And at first that was understood partly to mean dark, in a riddling sense, that he was writing these gnomic, difficult to decipher, aphorisms, and partly, people would later accuse him of being obscure on purpose. Diogenes Laertius actually tries to come up with an explanation for why Heraclitus is trying to hide his meaning from the reader. But that's because Diogenes Laertius is of a later generation that no longer understands the arche. So he assumes that if it's obscure, it must be gratuitously obscure to mislead, as opposed to Heraclitus's original position, which is, I'm trying to bring you closer to the way things actually are, not the way you would prefer them. And the way they actually are is harder to understand than the way you would prefer them. I assure you, when Kenneth Smith calls Heraclitus archaic, he's pulling all that in, that he means all of those things. So he thinks about Heraclitus that way. The same archaic philosopher who grasped, now see the word grasp? You remember Heraclitus has a fragment where he says, that Homer was fooled by the lesson of the children plucking lice off of themselves, when they say, what we grasp we leave behind, but what we have not grasped, these we bring away with us. The word grasp occurs 3 times in that Heraclitus fragment, and here he's using the word grasp. Right? This is not an accident. Kenneth Smith has Heraclitus on his mind, and that fragment's one of his favorites. So the same archaic philosopher who grasped the irony and treachery of human desires. And if we read grasped in that sense, then it means he's saying that Heraclitus is a philosopher who, because he understood the irony and treachery of human desires, he was able to liberate himself from always being fated by the wants of his naive character. He was able to cultivate his own character so that he could want something else. And he was only able to do that because he had grasped what his character was, so that he could leave its original naive state behind and move on to something better. All of that is implied explicitly if you know how Kenneth reads and writes, and if you've read Heraclitus and gotten used to, what are the keywords that Kenneth Smith is using here. One of the books that Kenneth Smith recommends on his reading list is a book called Keywords. He's focused on these key pieces of vocabulary. So, the same archaic philosopher who grasped the irony and treachery of human desires also made the most decisive statement of ancient fatalism. And of course, here we're talking character as fate. So that means if we're talking about fatalism, we're talking about character. And just like Sharon pointed out before, if we're talking about character and fate, then we're also talking about freedom. And where is the scope for freedom and for individuation within this framework? All of this is being referred to. Heraclitus said, it would not be better for men if they got what they wanted. Now, that's one of Heraclitus's most famous fragments. It's been alluded to a few times today, but it's worth knowing that the book on Heraclitus that Kenneth Smith began writing, he was going to write a series of them before he got interrupted. One of the first books he was going to write, that he wrote, I think, 100 essays in so far, is called It Would Not Be Better for Men If They Got What They Wanted. So how important is this topic to Kenneth Smith that he's bringing up here? It's incredibly important to him. And also that character is fate, right? Which, as I've been saying since the beginning of section E, is where he got the concept daimon and eudaimonia that this whole section is named after. I promised you when we began section E that Kenneth Smith was this whole section was drawing deeply off Heraclitus because of the use of the word daimon, and then the use of the word character in like the first sentence of the thing. But now he's just coming out and saying it. Yes, I read Heraclitus. Yes, Heraclitus made a big difference to me in understanding the ancient Greek perspective. This whole section is steeped in Heraclitus, and specifically the fragments character is fate, and it would not be better for men if they got what they wanted, are all over these paragraphs we spent the last few weeks going through. This is what he's thinking while he's writing. What we are now, before I go on, I'll call on Joseph. Go ahead, sir. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Now, I'm just thinking back to, again, what Phil said a little bit earlier about Arjuna, and even just thinking about, religions in the past and what we talked about religion in the past weeks as well. That there's something interesting about those individuals, whether it be Christ or Arjuna or whomever, is that they don't get what they want. That's one thing, that they're maintaining their character and following their fate. That's what I think it's, the message is. It's not necessarily, go to war. It's that this is what you're meant to do. And you may not like it. You may not like being crucified, but this is what you're supposed to be doing. This is your role. And I kind of see that in what Kenneth is saying, in the sense that, and it's also, there's this idea not following your desires and understanding your ego in that process as well. And that is liberating, because then you can create the tool, or even, you can have a level of self-control that allows you to truly be free from yourself. And in addition to being free from everything else in society as well. I mean, you're liberating yourself on a macro level and a micro level. And so I that's the way I kind of see this. As we've talked a lot about desire, though, as just those are two instances of just people that aren't going to get what they want. And anyway, just the religious mythos, part of that.
Is that the meaning of that Rolling Stone song, Satisfaction?
I get no satisfaction.
I can't get no satisfaction. Yeah, right.
I thought that was an Epicurean
Get what you
song.
want, you get what you need.
It's not that kind of satisfaction.
Yeah. Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, right on money. This is good stuff. So what we are inwardly most determined to be, and the very mindless biases through which we believe we are advancing our self-interests, those are merely the mask behind which fate advances its patterns, its interlocking weave of unintended consequences. So the law of unintended consequences being invoked right there at the end, at the end of that sentence, right? That this is the problem, that we live in an infinite cosmos, but we're trying to understand it with a finite mind and a finite will. And so when we make choices, we're missing most of the picture. And the things we set in motion may or may not give us what we were focused on getting. But in addition to that, they're going to give us a whole bunch of other things, some of which might be serendipitous and delight us, but many of which are going to appall us, and we're not going to want to be responsible for, even though, in fact, we were the ones who set it in motion. There is this bull in a china shop model that the ancients have for every single mortal life, that we are constantly pulling on all these threads of fate every time we act. And at the exact same time we're doing it, we're denying that we're doing it. We think we're taking a simple, straightforward action, and we don't understand that we're actually launching 1,000 ships, right? The face that launched 1,000 ships, we've taken for granted as a phrase that becomes thought terminating. But think about it. I mean, what is the least action you could take to try not to cause unintended consequence? You say, well, I won't do anything. I'll just sit here. But if your face alone could still be enough, just not even acting, just your face is enough to launch 1,000 ships. This is the human condition, right? That we're a thread and a weave, and every time our thread moves, we're tugging on all the rest of the weave. All kinds of things are moving when we move. And even if we try to hold still, we're woven in with all the other things. So there is this isn't about, giving up, but it's about respecting the mystery of the human condition, that there are infinitudes at every step. And even in not stepping, there are infinitudes. I can't step in the same river twice because other waters are flowing. I step and I do not step. I am and I am not. He's not trying to be obscure. He's trying to say there is a lot more happening in the simple things that we think we're doing than is actually than we think is taking place, and that we may not want to be responsible for those consequences, but that doesn't change the fact that certainly nobody else is responsible for the things that we set in motion. I mean, so if it's not us, then who? And now we're back to Rabbi Hillel, right? If not now, when? If not me, then who? There's an invitation in this ancient worldview to raise up the level of our relationship with the world, to take more responsibility for these things that are happening around us. Because even though we are not the sole authors of any of it, we have a hand in more of it than we think we do. And there's more room here to make a difference if we can cultivate ourselves to pay attention to it and engage with it than we think there is. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, this just reminds me of the spider so much, right? Who weaves the web, the suspended adrift in essentially nothingness, right? So and even though this web, on the one hand, is sensitive to all the vibrations in its construct, it is always suspended in a state of vulnerability. I mean, that the whole thing might collapse. I think it's. I remember one of my paintings, I think in the last 5 years, the fallen angels. There's a halo, and in the halo was a web, and in the web was a single spider. I thought that was an interesting image, right? That in this construct that we made itself is not really on firm grounds, as we find that even the continents are drifting. So in some sense, I just want to say that quickly, that, that we are, our constructs are not resting on firm ground.
Yeah.
As our planet is not on a firm ground.
Yeah.
As our civilization is so much like the spider. I mean, in some sense, I feel, on the one hand, like you grew up always like, oh God, spiders, whatever. But I've become much more empathetic to the spider. In fact, there's a couple spiders that's living in my bathroom, and I just pretty much leave them alone, and just I try to be as friendly as I could without being outrageously friendly. I'm not
They have their work to do.
Yeah. So that's just very interesting. I just like them as a good thing to ponder on,
That's
how
right.
vulnerable their constructs really are.
That's right. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, there's this. I'll come back to it in a moment. Let me call on James first, since he's also got his hand up, and then I'll come back to the sentence. Go ahead, James.
This discussion about fate is interesting. Well, Nietzsche said that love your fate, right? Amor fati. So there's a kind of freedom in that, because you're free to you're free to love what is determined for you to do, right? So what is determined is you're determined to satisfy your needs. And I think maybe the wants are not part of your true character, because I guess the want is not is somehow more than what you need, and that's not and that's not what one's true character is. Yeah. So this idea of fate is interesting. That you were.
Yeah.
So I was just trying to find out what understand what free will is.
Right.
So free will is to just be what you're determined to be. Do you understand what you're determined to be? Is that your character?
So this gets really interesting. I mean, obviously one set of answers we'd give as moderns, but a different set of answers would be given to us from the ancient Greek perspective. And so, to a modern, to say free will just rolls off the tongue. It's so familiar, which then Hegel warns us about that familiarity. But to an ancient, if an ancient absorbs this idea of the daimon and the character as controlling what we want or don't want, what we notice or don't notice, and all the other kind of lacunae and default assumptions, then there's no such thing as free will in the way a modern means it, because will is always fated by character, right? We will something because we want it, and what we want and don't want is determined by our character. So therefore, no will can be free. But that's only half the picture, because the other half of the picture is, but we can modify our character. So we may not be able to make our will free, but we can freely make it bound to something other than what it is right now. You know what I mean? Who's calling the shots? This daimon. Who's giving the orders that tell us what we want and what we will? There's always going to be our daimon there controlling our will, but we could cultivate our daimon to become different, so that something healthier is controlling our will. And so now you've got a kind of freedom there, right? Where rather than an arbitrary freedom that says at any moment I might randomly do anything, and therefore it's okay, I must be free, we say, well, no, at any given moment you can only do what it's in the nature of your character to do, but I can recultivate my character further to change that field of what I do notice and don't notice, what I do want and don't want, what I will or don't will. It's very interesting. This is the dialectics of the ancient perspective. It makes us rethink the notion of free will, to come up with this alternative model in which the will is never free, but we may cultivate our character to change where it's getting its marching orders.
Well, that's also complicated by the fact that the web that we weave, like the spider, contains otherness.
Yes.
The others that we have to tend to. And, insofar as the web is to a great degree sensitive to the vibrations of otherness, and the otherness is not the other, it's us as well, is within us.
Right.
Then in a sense, I mean, the spider sort of survives because he's pretty much a loner. Right? And whatever flies into the web, well, heaven help them. I mean, that's just food.
Yeah.
But imagine if like a whole colony of others lived in that web. I mean, it's incredibly complicated.
Right.
So, so does that mean like in order to be a human, you have to like just be a hermit and go in the mountain and just live in the web on your own?
Right.
I mean, we're not that. So it's much more complicated.
It is. It's part of what I love about this model is that it's saying, yeah, there's fate, but fate's different than a modern thinks it is. And yes, there's freedom, but freedom is different than a modern thinks it is. And that the freedom and fate are related to each other. And and that they aren't just abstractions, but that they're both tied directly to our very identity, to our innermost character, and that these three things working together are in a dialogue, and that's where our fate and freedom come from. There's nothing like this in the modern world. We just don't have a concept like this, but it's very interesting. You can get a lot of traction out of it. I'm going to call on Stephen, and yeah, go ahead, Stephen. I'll call on. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm bringing up this question of the Greek states, this thing of internal breakdown. And this was a thing years ago. I've probably mentioned this a few times. Years ago, I was looking at investments at the market, and I was looking at the history of the market and what's going on there. I was trying to build a picture because I could foresee the global financial crisis in 2003. I picked 2008 as to when it was going to happen. And people thought I was very smart for doing that. But I look back now and you look at that whole period as like, how could they have missed what was going to happen? It was classic. All the classic signs were there. But they were damping down. The market was constantly singing, it's different this time. It's not going to happen. We're smarter than they were in the past. Even though all the warning signs are there, we're smarter. We've solved the problem. But it happened anyway. But in my journey collecting a lot of information, you come across comments, and they're very interesting. And one was the guy was saying, you know, in the past, the Republicans and the Democratic people, they would argue with each other. They would have different opinions, but they would respect each other. You know, back when I was a kid, they'll do all that, but they'll go and have a beer together and talk with each other like they're human beings. And he said that's changing now. They're not. They're treating each other like enemy camps. And this was about 20 years ago or something. I came across this bit of information, and it alerted me, and I looked into history, and I realised that what had happened is America had been the virtuous republic, but hadn't been the world power. After World War I, it was de facto the world power, but they didn't recognise it. Great Britain was still the top dog, in theory. The end of World War II, everybody suddenly realised America is the top dog. America had finally, you know, reached that moment. It was the world power. And since then, the Greek curse has been occurring in America. That very sound home economy is tearing itself apart. And we're seeing, after all these results, we still see America as a great power. But on the home front, it's tearing itself apart. And when I looked at that history, I couldn't emotionally imagine an America which would turn on itself and kill each other. But that's happened in the past too. You once had the Civil War. And I would say, from my understanding of history, that this difference between the two sides in America is running much deeper than people think. And you are heading for a world which I'd say is almost impossible to stop.
Yeah.
You're going to fight each other.
Yeah.
In some violent fashion. That's what history says. Emotionally, I couldn't imagine it, and I still struggle with it.
Yeah.
But that's it. The Greek curse is coming for America.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That's what a lot of Americans are afraid of, whether they want to talk about it openly or not. And they hope that if they don't talk about it, maybe it won't happen. But yeah, we're pretty deeply divided. I love that Nietzsche quote: "Free will without fate is no more conceivable than spirit without matter, good without evil." Thank you for sharing that. It's one of the, when you see the profundity of what he's talking about in section E here about daimon and character and fate and freedom, when you sort of see how sophisticated and complex this is, and that this is Kenneth Smith trying to channel the ancient perspective, And then you see that Nietzsche quote, right? Suddenly the Nietzsche quote comes into a new focus, and you realize that Nietzsche's talking about the exact same thing Kenneth Smith is talking about. Because Nietzsche is an ancient Greek philologist before he's an ancient Greek philosopher. First, he's a translator. He's trying to make sure that we're translating the Greeks correctly. And he's exploring the use of language and what things mean. And that leads him into his Greek philosophy as he comes to understand that the Greeks have a really different perspective on life than his fellow 19th century Germans do. And he starts writing about it, right? And so there's ways in which Nietzsche, you read Nietzsche and at first it seems to be slapping you in the face with the fact that he's not any other philosopher. He's just Nietzsche. This is obviously Nietzsche speaking. But when you get past that in-your-face style, what you discover is a lot of ancient Greek philosophy, just in new language. And right there in that quote, I mean, could that not be more clearly about this very subject that we've spent these last weeks reading about? Nietzsche was well acquainted with Heraclitus's work. He has flattering things to say about Heraclitus in his short book, Philosophy and the Tragic Age of the Greeks. If you haven't read that, you should. It's like a pocket. It's shorter than a pocketbook. It's like primer sized. It's very short little essays from Nietzsche on what he thought about each of the early philosophers. And when he gets to Heraclitus,
what's the name of it, Rick? What's the name of
Philosophy
it?
and the Tragic Age of the Greeks by Friedrich Nietzsche. Very short, unfinished, but you can see when you get to his section on Heraclitus, some of the previous philosophers, he's like, yeah, this guy's got some ideas that are good and some that are bad, and this guy's so-so. And then he gets to Heraclitus, he's like, whoa, this guy rocks, right? Nietzsche, suddenly is a fanboy, right, when he gets to his section on Heraclitus. And in that, you can see there's some fellow feeling between Nietzsche and Kenneth Smith in their assessment of how well does Heraclitus do at channeling this ancient worldview in some ways a purer form than the later classical philosophers do, right? Is less rhetorical, less rationalizing, and more just taking for granted the things that later philosophers are going to realize they have to explain. So this is part of it, that all this daimon stuff is talking about, that free will and fate don't make sense without each other as concepts. They're interdependent. And this Greek concept of the daimon and character has given us a way to relate them. Online question from about an hour ago. Isn't the problem the transhumanism that plagues these times? The idea that man should transcend and all? Yeah, well, yes, the Greeks and Kenneth Smith would agree that transhumanism is a problem and is very typical of the modern epoch. But we're going to have lots of time to talk about this question because it's going to be a major theme when we get to the modern section of this book, where he's going to talk about those things. So I'm not going to try to do justice to it now because it's an enormous topic. But the short answer is, yeah, Kenneth Smith would say, yeah, that's a problem. Donald, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I've spent a great deal of time on this free will versus determinism question, and I've come to the conclusion that my will should be free, and then all the actions resulting from it should be precisely determined.
By your will.
By my will, yes.
Yes.
Because if all these actions aren't determined, then my will has no power and is impotent. So what good is an impotent free will?
Yes, the exasperation of the human condition is that what good is it to have a free will if there's all these unintended consequences? It makes to the will, it feels like being impotent because I'm not getting just what I want. But of course, what it means is it's worse than that. We have a terrible power to unleash all kinds of things we don't want to unleash. That is guaranteed. No matter what else we do, we're certainly going to unleash the unintended consequences. And in fact, that power is so great, we can't stop it ourselves. Every time we act, boom, all these other things. Pandora opens the box and everything flies out into the world. And we're like, we may feel helpless, but what we discover is that we have the power to do things we don't want to do. We have that power whether we like it or not. It's like the One Ring, from Tolkien. It's like, yeah, well, I want to turn invisible, but I don't want to have my character corrupted. It's like, well, I want to be able to will the consequences I want, and to will not the consequences I don't want. It's like, well, no, you get the one, but you're gonna get the other, even if you don't like it. They're along for the ride, because free will without fate is no more conceivable than spirit without matter or good without evil. James, go ahead. Thanks for that, Donald. James, go ahead.
Yeah, have you looked into, or Kenneth looked into Bergson, Henry Bergson? Because he deals with this determinism of the Darwinian evolutionary theory. And then but he puts his own twist on that Darwinian evolutionary theory with his idea of free will. He wrote a book called, Creative Evolution, and also a book called Time and Free Will. So it'd be interesting to, kind of understand what he means by free will in that sense.
You're talking about Henri Bergson.
Yeah, Henri Bergson, yeah.
Yes. Kenneth has certainly read Henri Bergson and has recommended his books, I think, to all of his students at one time or another. I think I have a copy of Creative Evolution downstairs. I haven't read it yet, though. I'm embarrassed to admit I haven't read it yet, but I've read about it a lot, and I know it's one that Kenneth is very interested in. So thanks for introducing that one, because it's highly on brand for Kenneth Smith. Let me just type it into the chat here. Henri Bergson, Creative Evolution. And there's the link. Let me do a little quick paste. There we go. So yes, yeah, this whole area is just an endless mine of goodies to plumb. You can come back to it over and over and over. There's so much to work with here. And we will over the course of this book. Because see, each of these 8 lettered sections of chapter 4 incrementally is building up this ancient perspective, so that each letter that we advance, it gets more alien and more different from the modern perspective. And that alienness helps us to understand that the ancients are not just primitive versions of us. They're not just failed moderns who didn't know enough, who were too superstitious, which is how they're usually written. They actually have a completely different perspective that can see things that we can't see. It isn't just seeing the things we do see, it's also seeing things we can't see as moderns. And that's what establishes the value proposition of the entire book, that it is well worth struggling to learn how to put on the worldview of other epochs alien to our own, because it will let us think thoughts we couldn't think before and understand things we couldn't understand before. I'm about to take us to the final sentences of this paragraph, which is going to run us a little over, but I'm going to do it because we're going to finish section E today by hook or by crook. But before I do, I have to go back to the in the first half of this paragraph, which I quoted up above. I said what we are inwardly, Kenneth said, what we are inwardly most determined to be, and the very mindless biases through which we believe we are advancing our self-interest. Why does he say mindless? One of the challenges in reading Kenneth Smith is he's so value-laden, it's easy to assume he's insulting. Certainly moderns feel insulted when he makes value judgments that aren't in our favor. And so we're inclined to write off words like idiot or mindless as, poo-poo head, that they're just some kind of, he's just saying we're bad. But he's doing something far more interesting than that. When he says mindless, this is a reference to, among other things, the Buddhist discipline of mindfulness, right? In mindfulness, you learn to slow down this and create a space between stimulus and response, because without a space, you have no freedom. You're just acting out your character. By creating a space between the stimulus and the response, you can reflect on what's really happening here. And have I run into the situation before? And when I did the reflexive thing last time that I'm about to do this time, did it actually end well? Or should I maybe reconsider my default behavior? We talk about freedom and fate, but there's an element of it that occurs just in the question of whether or not we can be mindful in the moment. so that we have the capacity to make a choice. When he says mindless here, he's not just saying stupid or bad. He's saying, he's talking about our reflexive biases, our unreflective biases, what we do when we're not being mindful. And in mindless, he's also talking about a lack of awareness. And as you recall, the daimon rules over our character in large part, maybe even the greatest part, by which of the many infinite parts of the cosmos blur into the background and don't get noticed by us. We don't mind them in the sense of being a minder or paying attention to things. We are mindless. In any given situation, we're only mindful of 7 plus or minus 2 things, and we're mindless of an infinite number of things that our character has, without our permission or volition or awareness, has blurred away as being ceteris paribus, all else being equal, not relevant to the current situation, not the thing we're going to think about. He's saying through the phrase mindless biases, when he says that this is ruling us, this is how fate is exercising itself, he's saying that this reflexive act of nescience, of not paying attention to most things so that we can pick out what we're going to focus on, that operation, even before we begin thinking, has already fated us. We can't pay attention to the things that have been blurred away. We can only pay attention to the things that our character has picked out for us. It's like when people talk about fake democratic elections, where all of the candidates have been hand-selected to make sure that they won't rock the boat, and you're not able to choose, freely from among all the people who could run. You're only picking off of a, shall we say, a list that's been cultivated for you to limit your options while giving you the illusion of choice. When he says our mindless biases are actually the medium by which the fate of our character is exercising itself, he's saying that's the step right there. Before we even started thinking, there was bias applied that determined what we could even notice or consider. And right there, our fate was set in motion. I mean, maybe the fate hasn't said which of these 7 plus or minus 2 things is going to be the one that we dig into, and that's the path we take. But it certainly isn't going to be any of the infinite number of other paths that are all blurry to us right now and that we aren't noticing. This is the most powerful shackle upon our freedom, because it affects an infinite number of things and just boils it down to a handful. And anything that happens after that, the freedom has been framed in and constrained. So this is, the part of the reason I'm doing this is when I was first reading Kenneth Smith, good God, 25 years ago, I would read phrases like mindless biases impatiently and skip past them because they felt too insulting and value judgmental. I'm like, oh, he's just in a bad mood. He's just throwing stones. And I missed the more profound thing he was trying to say, which is that it doesn't matter how smart you are or how strong your will is, because it's only working with the material that your character has brought into focus, the few things. And it's already too late to notice all the other things that have been blurred out. The mindless biases are the working of the God, the daimon, within our character. Thus the spinning of the fate. So anyway, before we get to the end, Phil and then Donald, because I saw you had your hand up, and and Joseph had his hand up too. Don't think I'm going to forget. So how about Phil, then Joseph, then Donald? So go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, good discussion between what Donald said and your response. And it just seems to me, I'm going to talk about, in a funny way, guardrails. I mean, the free will that needs, in a sense, a determined structure as a guardrail to manifest free will, total free will, is in essence, in my mind, I hate to say this because I like Donald, a marketing structure, right? So that it funnels back to me and my will. And I'm thinking there's a different kind of guardrail, which is really the dialectic, in my sense. And the guardrail is between oneself and the otherness that might be incorporated in oneself. And I wonder whether that is not diplomacy. Because there's your will, there's the other's will, whether that's individuals or nations. And how do you integrate that when it's so diversely operated? And I will find myself guilty of this in a sense, because I have certain biases as well. But it seems to me the dialogue that happens is the negotiation, the negotiating dance of will meeting otherness. And how do you intermingle those so that both sides begin to absorb the otherness within itself? Because short of that negotiation of diplomacy, which is a subtle relationship of words and exchange of ideas, then there's the ultimate resolution, which is conflict, in which the stronger will, presumably, with the stronger material, will win. But there will be a lot of pain in the meantime. And the question becomes, it's like,
Yes.
to what degree does one want to suffer the pain even in victory?
Yes. That's right.
Short of the guardrails that will try to channel it away from the ultimate arbitrator, which is war. Right? And we're managed in many ways to avoid that by the arts. You want more? Let's just have boxing within the guardrail, you know? And it just seems to me diplomacy, I think it's an art form. It's not a science, it's an art form of negotiation, because each side does not understand the other side. And how do you come to incorporate that understanding into a concept? Like I said, what the Athenians didn't have that model. So there's, I sort of understand where you're coming from. So that's a different kind of guardrail. That's a guardrail of dialectics, not a guardrail marketing. Right. Sorry, Donald. That even though I like you, I have to expose that. That's look, I'm with you, Donald, because I'm quite a long ways with you, but I do understand the Middle Earth is the difference between the separation of the blue and the red.
Thank you, Phil.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Joseph, you're next.
Just briefly, I think that and I read this paragraph a little bit earlier, and I think that this kind of gets to part of the answer to the question that I posed a little bit earlier, is that, regarding character and formation and the space between the stimulus and the response, is that, that mindlessness, that ability to kind of increasing that space is essentially the way I look at forming. Like, that's one of the ways I look at forming character. So you're not on just automatically responding
right
to things. And that's mindless bliss. Like, this idea yes, this mindless bliss, that you're able to make your own personal decisions, whatever that is. And as much as you possibly can, given all the circumstances that have led up to that particular moment in time.
Yeah.
That allows you to then make a decision that might have been a little bit different. And I think that that's kind of that spark of free will that we're talking about here a little bit, that spark of, maybe that's what you're trying to create for yourself.
Yes.
And that's the way I read what Kenneth is saying on so many different levels, on how to analyze that, how to actually make that happen on a very, very deep level.
Yes.
That's the way I read this. And I liked, I like that specific example. It's like, how do you create that space then? And that's the question you have to ask yourself.
That's
and
right.
that's a very complex, very deep. I mean, that's basically what everything we've been covering.
Yes.
But then, yeah, so that is, and the challenge is to realize how little space that you've created after all the hard work that you've put in.
Yes.
Like, I mean, that's the thing, is that, it's that you're always having to, work a little bit harder actually to actually create that space too. Anyway, I don't know.
It's good. Thank you, Joseph.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's the opening up space between the stimulus and the response gives you room to breathe. And in so doing, it lets the oxygen in so that the spark of free will can grow. Right? Without oxygen, it stagnates, and we're left behaving not autonomously, automatically, based on our default character responses.
We're hyperventilating.
Yeah, right. So, Sharon, go ahead. You got your hand up.
So I would like to read the last 3 sentences. May I?
Please.
It says, to all things in nature, there is such a double facet. Everything on the one hand, everything controlling it. Let me start over. To all things in nature, there's such a double facet. Everything on the one hand, the controlling energy of its distinctive form, and yet everything is also the vulnerable blind matter out of which it is constituted. We believe we govern and direct ourselves. We know ourselves via our inner forces and order. Yet these are far more than the familiar face they show us. The germs of fate are inhaled, and I do like that verb, just through those taken for granted habits. But I want to introduce another concept that we never talked about, our consciousness. Our consciousness, which governs all of this, holds together a set of contradictions. That's how I think it operates. So I like that sentence about nature.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Me too. Yeah, exactly. This is with this model, we're able to understand things, even about modern behavior, that the modern perspective on free will and determinism can't seem to explain. We look at the history of the 20th century in particular, and the enormous crises that like Paul Valéry wrote about, that World War I precipitated. They were, before that, they were thinking we're in this great march of progress leading to enlightenment, and maybe we will banish war and there will never be war again, and we will resolve all things diplomatically and wisely. And next thing they know, they're caught up in a world war. An entire generation is dying. And they're like, how is this even possible? What has occurred here? And the answer is, they didn't know themselves the way they thought they knew themselves. There are aspects of their character as moderns that was invisible to them. And as a result, their own behavior surprised themselves to such an extent that, a whole generation of people came back traumatized from the war and never recovered from it. So like this destroyed their understanding of the world and their place in it. And it was just in the taken for granted habits. It was in the questions they didn't ask, the assumptions that had been made, and therefore the things that were not part of their conscious decision making that were controlling the fact that there would even be a war and that it would be so horrific. This is one of the things about that phrase, mindless biases, which is of course coming through here with taken for granted habits, that Kenneth Smith is really strong on. And he works over and over in his text to try to bring it into visibility for us. But it's very hard for us because as moderns, it's a lesson we not only don't want to hear, We don't know that we don't want to hear it. We have this ability to read past it and not see it and read it as anything other than what it's saying. But what it's saying is one of Kenneth Smith's core pieces of philosophy, which he draws out of the ancient perspective, is that although a culture wants to be thought of in the terms in which it describes itself, a culture can be better understood in terms of the things it doesn't understand about itself. That in some ways, it's the things that a culture prepares its members never to think, never to say, never to do, never even to understand is a possibility. Those things are the fingerprints of the culture, more than what the culture thinks it's about. And they end up shaping the long-term story of that culture. This is why he talks about surds, which are inexpressible ideas, and lacunae, the parts of the text that have dropped out, that aren't present, even though they should be present. He talks about surds and lacunae. He talks about blind spots. He talks relentlessly about what is this blurred out part of the world that our worldview prepares us not to notice, and that keeps setting in motion the story of our lives. And if we can learn to turn away from the 7 ± 2 things that our character tells us as the important parts, and to ask questions about the blurry stuff and say, yeah, but what's back there? What is it that you don't, what is it that my character doesn't want me to see? And, you know, what can I learn from that? This is how you get control over your life and start to develop some freedom and individuate yourself as a person to become more than just a symptom of those 7 ± 2 things. So we'll come back to this next week. I'm not going to try to drag everything out of this that's present, but thank you, Sharon, for taking us to these sentences, because this is at this point, so far, we've got 3 more lettered sections to go, but so far in chapter 4, this is as much of a punchline as he's built so far, to try to portray how differently did the ancients see the world than the way a modern sees the world. These sentences right here, this is, I think by this point, everybody who's participating in this can see how different this is than what we're taught in school. So thanks, everybody. We'll pick it up again next week.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, everybody.
I just want to ask a parting question.
Sure.
Can our mind, I should say a part of our mind, can our instrumental mind handle complexity and contradictions?
Yes.
Well, thank you for the yes. That's one vote for yes. Maybe your mind is not instrumental enough. I think we might be trapped in the instrumental mind. You know, that's the nature of civilization. So,
but don't you think if we have the idea that we have we can expand our minds in the media and in conversations, that it happens automatically?
Certainly the first step to getting out of the trap of the worldview we're born into is understanding that it can happen, that it's worth investing in doing.
That there's a possibility because others have done it.
Yes. Yes.
And okay.
And this,
yes.
This comes back to Donald's core point that Kenneth Smith says over and over. To understand the possibility of the heuristic life, we really need to find and look at an Aristos, because the example tells us more clearly than any argument that it must be possible, because look, this person is doing it. And it's part of where as moderns we're challenged in that we don't have the examples around us.
I just stole that from Aristotle. Don't credit me with that.
Yeah.
I have to ask why women are such optimists. You get a very optimistic streak in women.
I don't
Not so
think
much
it's
in
women.
men.
Remember
Than
to
the
ask the
alternative.
converse, Stephen. Maybe the question is, why are you such a pessimist?
Right. Yeah, that's
Stephen, I don't think it's women. I think it's a personality. I lived a life in which I managed risk. every single day, every single minute. You must be an optimist if you want to succeed. You must be.
Definitely.
And that's just it.
And on
And
that note, we're going to break for today.
claiming
And
that women are characteristically optimists more
Next
so
week-
than men.
next week we'll pick up where we left off, and it might be right
Thank
here. on
you
the
very
topic.
much, guys. I
I
really
think
enjoyed
Stephen's an
this.
economist, so I think that has something to do with his pessimism. So
I gotcha.
take
Thanks a lot, everybody.